How's everybody doing today? All right, so if everybody knows where the chat box is, if you could just do me a favor and jot down in there, and if there's any concerns you specifically have about the agreement of sale or anything you're confused about that we could discuss, so I could just make a little note of it, and we can work on that hopefully throughout this time that we have together. So I look forward to it. That'll be the best spot to drop any questions you have in reference to the agreement of sale or specific paragraphs. So, and of course, just full disclaimer, always consult your broker, always consult your office manager, run it up the flagpole in your own office about how your office wants to handle business, etc. All right. Assuming everybody can hear me, correct? Thumbs up for the people who are on screen. Perfect. All right. So let's get started. The agreement of sale, it is no longer 2 pages. Yeah. Oh, Ariel, that's a good one. We'll talk about appraisal.
Thanks. See you later.
Yeah. So the agreement of sale is no longer 2 pages. It's just a couple more than 2. And then we don't include any of the addendums. But I think if we start out really simple, everybody understand buyer and seller. All right. Everybody can understand buyer and seller. Good. Make sure the reason why the mailing addresses are on there came out of the mortgage companies needing it. Why, I still don't know, but it exists. Property is pretty simple, except if you have a hyphenated address, sometimes those hyphenated addresses, like 1, 2, 3, 4 dash, 5, 6 or 7, 8, whatever it is, make sure that there are not multiple parcel tax identification numbers or IDs, etc. So keep that in mind in there. School district of blank came into play because we had a lot of agents who were selling property and people were assuming they were in a school district when they were not in the school district that they thought they were in, if that makes sense. So that's where school district came out. A lot of you, I know you do Philadelphia region. So we don't often use parcel or lot and block and deed book, page number, etc., but that always is there. Any questions so far? I think we try to take it slow this morning. All right. All right. So this is where we get into the confusion. All right. So when you go to fill this section out, a lot of people are like, oh yeah, absolutely 100%. Whether or not your broker is single agent representing only one side or a dual agent representing both parties, both the buyer and the seller in the transaction. Where we see the major confusion is on the other side. Now, every single one of you has a cell phone. I'm assuming some of you, it might flip. Some of you, it might not flip. I'm not 100% sure. Oh, very good. Thank you, Matthew. Much better. Much better. Now you can see the screen, right? Everybody seeing the screen now? Much better. Okay, perfect. So these agency boxes become an issue when the buyer's agent, who is the one typically filling out the agreement of sale, does not know how the other side practices. There have been lawsuits where when an agent checks that all licensees in the company represent the party, lawyers have actually served all licensees in the company. So make sure you check with your broker or your manager, your office manager, to make sure how your company practices, whether it is in fact a dual agency, are you designated agent, or are all of your licensees representing the party? So keep that in mind. Any questions on these so far? They added the company license number and the state license number for the agents. That came out because of TRID. When TRID came out and said we needed all our license numbers on there. So that's where that came from. A lot of people ask, well, whose license number? It's best to put everybody's license number on there. So if it's multiple people in the transaction, put everybody's license number on there. It's always better to over disclose. And then this was strategically placed here on purpose. The dual and or designated agency box was placed at the bottom of the first page right before the buyer or the seller initial. It was done on purpose. It gives them one last opportunity to go ahead and say, okay, wait a minute, what is this? So it's one last opportunity before they put their initials on the page to say, by the way, remember, this is what type of relationship we have. Now, a lot of you may not realize that there's a way to tell which document is being presented to you, because agreements of sale are still out there from the last revision and will probably still be out there from the last revision once we hit July 1st. So in the bottom right-hand corner of the very first page of a document, you will find the date, the copyright date, but you will find the revision date and then the release date. So this is always one good way to find out if an agent has presented you a current agreement of sale, or if you are being presented an older agreement of sale. Now, what happens when a new release comes out? The older versions are no longer available. However, people PDF them, they save them, they just change people's names on them, whatever they do, but they do exist out there. So always check the bottom right-hand corner to make sure that you are on the same page. Okay. Now, this is obviously by this agreement. This is where everybody puts the date that you put the agreement together. That is not the execution date. That is not the date that everybody signed and agreed. That is the date that the agent typed in the agreement of sale. Now, the purchase price. Any questions on the purchase price? We think we got that? All right, let's talk about the trouble spot known as line 7, paragraph 2, A1, the initial deposit. The way that the contract is written, as of right now, it's blank days, 5 if not specified. So the buyer would have 5 days to give their first deposit. What if the buyer on day 3 says, I changed my mind, I don't want the house? What happens? Day 3, buyer just turns around and says, you know what, I never mind. Anybody know?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, I believe that if he changes his mind and he doesn't give you a deposit, then there is no agreement of contract.
There's no what?
No agreement of contract.
Well, so here comes one of the biggest questions that we always get, which is the way that the contract is written now. If the seller doesn't, if there's no deposit, there's no deposit. The seller can only go after the deposit that's in hand. If there's no deposit, there's no deposit to go after. Does that make sense? So if the buyer changes their mind on day 3, and thanks for contributing, that was good, that if the buyer changes their mind on day 3, there's no skin in the game and the seller can't go after the deposit because it wasn't there. So for my listing agents, what do you think you want to do? There's 2 things that you would want to do as a listing agent currently that is, that could help solidify the deposit. Number 1, move those days. Move the days. Don't accept the 5 days. Move the days to 1 day. Another thing is uncheck G underneath of paragraph 26, which we'll get there. So my buyer agents, heck, ride the 5 days. It depends on which hat you're wearing. But when it comes to this deposit, if the initial deposit is not received and the buyer changes their mind, there's no skin in the game. There is no, way for the seller to go after the buyer's deposit if 26G is checked. So we'll save the questions on 26G till we get to the end. But the initial deposit within blank days was also put in to assist with the second deposit. Unfortunately, what we're seeing on the market is we're seeing the creative juices flow from agents under line 3, such as 72 hours after home inspection reply, 72, 48, 24 hours after acceptable home inspection. Now, let me ask you a question. who's acceptable home inspection? Because the seller was extremely happy the second you did the inspection and got out of the house. The seller is satisfied with home inspection. Think about it. Satisfied home inspection contingency. Well, the seller was satisfied. You didn't say who needed to be satisfied. You just said satisfied. See, this is where we get in trouble as agents trying to practice law and getting creative. And again, please consult your brokers, your managers, et cetera, and talk about these things. Another thing is we see, you know, within 48 hours after, you know, executed reply to inspection, we have a reply to inspection form. It clearly says reply to inspection on it, right? Anybody use that form? How many signatures are on it? And who is it from? The buyer. So the buyer signs the reply to inspection. So the seller is assuming once that reply to inspection is signed, that the second deposit is then owed. Because that's not clearly what was stated. It leaves it open and vague. So you need to be very careful when you are utilizing line 3 and getting creative with your juices. The other thing is we have seen mediation, because a seller literally took the 72 hours very literally. And the moment that the DocuSign or dot loop was signed, the seller started the clock. And it happened to be a hefty first deposit. And the seller went after it because the buyer was in default because the second deposit wasn't received within quote unquote 72 hours. All right. So be very careful when you get to line 3. Please talk to your brokers about it. Please talk to your manager about it. The other thing is there's nothing in the agreement of sale that talks about what is satisfaction or satisfied or who is satisfied. So, and some of you might be saying, well, why the heck do you have number 3 in there? Well, there's various reasons. Number 3 could definitely come into play after, after the roof is installed, or something that you might have pre-negotiated, something along those lines, or maybe you're breaking it down to 3 deposits. You very well could just take the language, additional deposit within blank days of execution, and repeat the language for a 3rd deposit. So just be very, very careful about that.
Heather?
Yep.
I had a situation recently where the buyer was super late with their deposit, and my client was asking me, like, because they broke that one term, like, isn't the whole contract invalidated?
Well, see this. So here I'm going to break a misconception. When we go with a deposit, deposits do not make the contract. The signatures do. The deposit is contingency. So a seller could sign a contract and a buyer can sign a contract and there's 0 deposit whatsoever. It's still a valid contract. The other thing it gets into muddy water, Faith, is when somebody does not perform, then the other party needs to then react. Again, I'm not an attorney, please consult your broker or your manager, but the other party would have to react and say, you're in default of the contract because of X, Y, and Z, and then have to terminate the contract if they so choose, of course, after seeking advice.
Right, but if they didn't choose, that seller could still sue the buyer later for a specific performance if he so
If they
wanted.
did not, and this is why as a listing broker, the checkbox in 26 here, I'm just going to fast forward to it and we're going to come back to it later on today. But when we get to this checkbox right here, for a listing agent, this checkbox is very powerful because that checked off by a buyer's agent says they can only go after the deposit. And if there is no deposit, there's nothing to go after. If that checkbox is unchecked, then the seller has other resources available to them.
Gotcha.
All right, now I got a couple questions in the chat. Give me 1 second to just catch up here. So Yogi, you asked about 2 days after inspection resolution. Whose resolution? What's the definition of resolution? What does it mean resolution? Because I thought we were resolved when I told you, no, we're not doing it. See, this is the whole thing. It becomes an issue going back and forth between agents because there's nothing clearly outlined. And I can't wait to get to the paragraph 32B and talk about inspections are for informational purposes only. Yeah. So if the listing agent is presented with an older version of the agreement to share, what should the listing agent do? Should they request the buyer's agent to redo it? It's up to you, Kevin. I mean, obviously it's talk to your clients and talk to your broker because they're going to be the ones, you know, and which version is it? How far back? What changed? Because there are some things that we changed in the contracts and in our documents that we need to change because legal has changed something or something in the industry has changed. So we're making sure we're protecting all of our agents. Then there's some changes that are made because we're seeing agents misuse or use things the way they shouldn't be using them. So, and owner, you said if a team, do you list everyone? It's always better to go ahead and list everybody who's in the transaction and going to be involved. And we're going to hold our 26G until the end because we're going to get there. Other thing is we see a lot of agents out there now where your companies are mandating wired funds. This contract is not between you and the other broker. This contract is between the buyer and the seller. You need to be clear. If you know that the other company will not accept a personal check, then what you need to do is address it within the agreement of sale. 2B clearly says that all funds paid by buyer, including deposits, will be held, by check, cashier's check, or wired funds. There is nothing stopping you from striking out check. Okay. So it would read, will be paid by cashier's check or wired funds. Or if they're not accepting a cashier's check, you cross out check and cashier's check. Because if you have your client sign it, you are going by what is written, not what you agreed to, not what was in the MLS, not what you had talked about on a Friday afternoon, not what was in your presentation letter that you added to Bright or whatever it was. It's the contract. So if the contract still reads that they can give you a check, a cashier's check, or wired funds, then the options are still available. Another thing, deposits. You are also might be seeing a lot of companies say, have the title company hold the deposit. My title company will hold the deposit. Have the lawyer, have this, have them, have, whatever hold the deposit. What you need to understand as agents is that following on line 18, paragraph 2C, only real estate brokers are required to hold deposits in accordance with the rules and regulations of the Real Estate Commission. What that means is we know by practicing, oh, my broker can't release the deposit, even though I'm the listing agent to the seller, without both parties agreeing to where the release goes. That is not the same. Okay, that is not the same for everyone. So before you turn over your buyer's deposit to a title company, to an attorney, to whomever it's being held with, you may want to check it before you wreck it. All right. Because there have been some people who have handed it over to their own personal title company, and all they needed to do was say to the title company, I want my deposit back, and the title company returned the deposit to them. Okay. So keep that in mind. All right. Any questions on 2 so far? Okay. Should we dust off paragraph 3? I know it's been a while since y'all been using that one. Yeah. I know, could make a comeback. All right, so obviously seller assist, be very careful. I see a lot of agents put in here $1 and a percentage. Make sure your numbers are correct and that your client is getting the money that they had, looked forward to. All right, so just keep that in mind. Any questions on that? The other thing is it still reads, all of our documentation still talks about what the mortgage company will allow them to receive. So that's still in there. Okay. All right. Settlement date. So in Pennsylvania, settlement date is the settlement date. We have to make sure that we're not doing it on a holiday or when the banks are closed, et cetera. And the other thing is, or before if buyer and seller agree. It's always good to use the change in terms addendum. I know a lot of people call it the CIT, but or CIA or whatever you're calling it. It's the CTA, change terms addendum, CTA form. And that CTA form has a majority of the most common items that would be changed in an agreement of sale, including settlement date. It's always better to get them to put it in writing that everybody agrees. It's always a better cover yourself. So another thing that was added a couple of years ago. So when you're looking at the headlines and of all of the agreement of sale, you'll notice there's a parentheses and a date behind it. That will tell you the most recent change and when it took place to that paragraph. So this one happened in 2014, this was touched. But when this took place, this talked about counties, having settlement within the county or what? Close connected, right? Adjacent county. Obviously, time is of the essence, and as we're going to get into that next, but settlement, everything's prorated. A lot of people more recently, where the buyer was paying the transfer tax, they were putting it at the end of the agreement of sale saying buyer's willing to pay the seller's transfer tax. Well, 4F covers that. So 4F says, hey, it's going to be divided equally unless otherwise stated here. And that's where you can put if the buyer is going to be willing to pay the seller's transfer tax. The other thing is underneath of 4E. So 4E, if you are dealing with an estate, if you're dealing with an administrator, if you're dealing with a sheriff's deed or any other deed, the agreement of sale calls for a fee simple deed of special warranty, which means that the seller is only liable for when the seller had possession of the property, etc. If you're dealing with an attorney and they're handling an estate, I will guarantee you that they will turn around to you and tell you that they will not handle that. They want an executor, executrix, or administrator deed. So you have to be very careful if you're handling an estate or any other situation where the deed is going to be anything other than special warranty. On the flip side, buyer's agents often don't know what kind of deed the title company is going to use. And in some cases, the title company likes to use a general warranty deed because that helps protect the buyer and the title company a little bit further. So unfortunately, there have been some general warranty deeds that have been used, and the agreement of sale calls for special warranty. So keep in mind E4E if you're going to be dealing with any other deeds other than a special warranty deed. Now, G and H becomes a problem when there is a tenant occupying the property. So the way that it is written, you're going to give possession to be delivered by deed, existing keys, and physical possession to a vacant property free of debris with all structures. Now, here comes this word here. Broom clean. Buyer's agents, do me a favor. Set the expectation for the buyer. What broom clean means. Broom clean means literally broom swept. It does not mean your family is coming for the holiday and you scrub the house top to bottom. It says broom clean in the agreement of sale. If you want it scrubbed top to bottom, then you should adjust it and change it. So you're going to broom clean it day and time of settlement unless seller before signing this agreement has identified in writing that it's subject to a lease. Okay, so now we have a property where there is a tenant in the house. Maybe it's a duplex, maybe it's a triplex, maybe it's single family. The next paragraph talks about if the seller did identify in writing that the property was subject to a lease, then it's been, you get the lease and you get the tenant. Now here comes an issue for most landlords. Line 47. Seller will not enter into any new leases. All right, that makes sense. You're not going to, sign on a new tenant, comma, or nor extend existing leases. So you have a property that has a month-to-month tenant. You have a landlord who's selling the property. The tenant is month-to-month. The agreement of sale says that they cannot do what? Yeah, they can't extend the existing lease. And most landlords I know do not want to let go of the money if the deal's not solid, right? They don't want to give the tenant, notice to vacate if the deal is not going to go through. So be very careful on this one where it says nor extend any existing leases, because then it also says, for the property without the written consent of the buyer. So of course, listing agents, if there is a month-to-month lease situation, et cetera, and the landlord wants to keep the tenant until, notice needs to be given or whatever, make sure you get the written consent of the buyer. So the buyer is going to, acknowledge the leases by initialing the leases at the execution of this agreement. All right. Unless otherwise stated in this agreement. So most people don't want to turn over the leases right away, which is why we now moved the tenant occupied property addendum from the back of the agreement to the front of the agreement on line 50. So this is the TOP form, which gives the seller X amount of days to hand over the leases to the buyer for review, and the buyer gets X amount of days to say, all right, I'm in or I'm out. Just in case the seller may have fudged a few of the details and the buyer finds out that it really was not leased for that long of time or at the amount that they said that was. Okay, so far so good. We're getting into juicy details. So paragraph 5, this is where we get into a lot of confusion with agents saying, well, was it executed on this day or was it executed on that day? So the date that the agreement of sale is signed is one thing. But what if there was an initial change? Okay, something changed and it needed to be initialed. So what they're saying here, the execution date of the agreement underneath of 5C is the date when the buyer and seller have indicated full acceptance by signing and or initialing. So do yourself a favor, agents, listing agent and selling agent. Make sure your client's initial end date. That is very important, because if you're making a counteroffer, the seller can sign the agreement, right? And they made a change to the agreement to make the counter. Then the buyer initials the counter. It's not the date of the signature. It would be the date of the last initial. But if the buyer didn't initial and date, then what? You can only go by the dates that are on the contract. So be very careful about that. And of course, let's just say we sign an agreement of sale and everything's good and we're good to go today on the 28th. Day one is tomorrow. Day one is tomorrow. All right.
Heather,
Yeah.
can I interrupt? It's Bruce Benjamin.
Hi, Bruce.
Thank you for doing this. It's wonderful. It's always good to have this. I've been an agent for almost 15 years, but I always like doing this. So question on that paragraph. So buyer signs it Tuesday night, Wednesday, the seller signs it. The agent doesn't send it over till Thursday. Wednesday 1.
So delivery and acceptance. I mean, if that agent put that agreement of sale in the good old snail mail and put it in the hands of the United States government, the day is set in stone as the day that they put it in that and signed it. You know, I mean,
Email it. They email it Thursday instead of Wednesday. What's
Then
day
it-
one?
and here comes the whole question of, well, when does it start? Does it start Thursday or Wednesday? Did they notify you that it started? Like, hey, we got it signed and I'll get it back to you. You know, I mean, welcome to the gray area, Bruce. It's
Yeah.
always, so if you were to go to a court of law, they most likely will take the written document over verbal. But check with your broker. Always
Yeah.
check with your broker.
Yeah, I have. Thank
Yeah.
you. Appreciate it.
I mean, trust me, as a buyer's agent, you always want to get as many days as you possibly can. Yeah.
Clarity is better than an extra day.
And that's why I always find it's good you send the other side a timeline. Hey, let's make sure we're on the same page.
Always do. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Heather,
Mhm.
hi, it's Naomi. I
Hi,
have
Naomi.
one question about the time of the essence. That's what we were on, right?
Yep, time is of the essence.
Okay, so the times of the essence is, let's say tomorrow,
Mhm.
but buyer and seller sign on Thursday. Do you have to change that date?
Okay, so, all right, so this is where letter A has become an issue. So we changed it a couple years ago because it used to say, you know, the buyer had or seller had so much time to reply, and then the seller would counter the buyer, but the agent would forget to change the seller's name to the buyer's name, so it became confusing. So we took it out and we just said written acceptance by all parties on or before. So I've heard legal arguments in both capacities where the buyer could have withdrawn at any point in time, but the buyer left it out there for the seller to sign. You know, I don't have a clear cut, answer on that one, because it should be signed by that time and by that date. And if it's not, You know, it's always good on a buyer side to send a, hey, FYI, we're out, just to CYA, cover your assets. This has been a discussion back and forth with, you know, the lawyers at PAR on a constant about this one. And we have arguments on both sides. So I wish I had an answer for you, but Naomi, I'm going to have to go with the legal, it depends.
Well, but so when you execute the document tomorrow, Thursday, and the time of the essence is tomorrow, should that date get changed?
It's always good to use the CTA. So let's just say so today is the 28th and it had until the 28th for us to get signed, right? What's stopping the buyer's agent from either redoing the agreement of sale and resending it, or going and get a CTA, having the buyer sign the CTA with the new extension date to the 30th?
Nothing. Gotcha.
Right.
I just wanted to see if that date does not get changed.
Then it becomes a gray area. So why, if we have all the tools, let's not keep a gray area on the table.
Got it.
Yeah. So it's always best practice, change it. If you know the seller is not going to do anything until the 30th, which is Thursday, change the date. Send a CTA. Keep everybody on the same level. It's always better to have clear than it is to have muddy and mucky water. Because we've argued that point back and forth. Should we change that language? Should we not change the language? And it always comes back to use the tools that we have, which is the CTA, or just change the agreement. All right, let's go to one of the only paragraphs that can blow up your entire agreement at the point when the buyer decides. So for my condo selling agents, for my multifamily, not zoned single family residential agents, paragraph 6 is a big one. It is so huge, it's not even funny. This is actually one of the paragraphs that the state says has to be in there by law. All right. If this is not filled in properly, the buyer at any point in time, all right, can void the contract and get all their money back. That's how big this paragraph is. It's only 4 lines, but it's huge. So if you are handling a multifamily property, and yes, Mark, yes, I've heard that if you don't remove the agreement, if you don't take it off the table, absolutely. That's why I always say, please consult your broker, your manager. Absolutely. There's arguments on both sides. But zoning. So property, condo, multifamily, this was not filled in. Day before settlement on a $1.25 million property, lawyer sends letter to listing broker and to title company saying, we're not going to settlement, please return the deposit. Why? Because this paragraph was not filled in. Because the property was zoned for multifamily. So that's how powerful this paragraph is. So be very careful of that one. The next one, where we get into the inclusions and exclusions, make sure you're reading and keeping up with everything that's in there. This also includes when we're talking about solar panels, if they're owned, windmills, if they're owned, water treatment systems, if they're owned, propane tanks, if they're owned, satellite dishes, if they're owned. Yes, Ariel.
Sorry, I didn't know if that was the right way to do it.
No, that's perfectly fine.
Okay, so in the first page, or no, where you fill in the address, whatever, the first page, you do fill in the present use. And here you fill in the zoning. Like, do you cover yourself by saying, like, this is how it's zoned, but it's presently being used as, and should have a legal use on file for?
So this is one of those things where this paragraph is so strong, right? That as a listing agent, because remember, who fills out the agreement? The buyer's agent.
Buyer's
does.
agent.
Right. So as a listing agent, besides looking at the price and the other terms, I look here and I fill out as much information to make it clear as I possibly can that this is not just solely zoned to permit single family dwellings, just as a CYA. That's how I practice though. But this is one of those paragraphs where I definitely, encourage you to go back to your manager and your broker and have a discussion with them as to how, they feel that you should fill it out. But this is one of those paragraphs where it could easily be overlooked because it is not filled out by the listing broker. It is filled out by the buyer's agent. And it's not something that's on their mind. But as a CYA, make sure you cover yourself, that you have everything, RSA 5 zoning currently used as multifamily, condo 5-unit building attached as a photograph and a diagram. Greg?
Yeah, so does this only apply to multifamily or single family as well?
So this one, when it talks about, except in cases where the property and each parcel thereof is zoned solely and primarily to permit single family dwellings. So you can have an RSA 5 land zoning, but it's a condo on top of it.
No, I understand that, but if I'm a listing agent for a single family home zoned RSA 5 and I receive an offer and we accept an offer, and either they listed the zoning as multifamily or they just didn't fill this out at all, and I missed that. Is it now, can the buyer therefore terminate the agreement at any point during the contract?
So is the property being used as a multifamily?
No,
Okay, so it's single family.
it's single family
Yeah.
home and it's zoned single family, but they
Right.
just didn't put anything there.
Well, and that's fine, because the way it says, if failure of this agreement, failure of it to have it inserted, except in cases where the property is single family or permitted solely for, single family dwellings.
Got
So
it.
no, this has to do with your RM1s, your C2, your CMX 2s, 2.5s and 1s and Ls and Is and Gs and, all of those that come into play. You're just better off covering yourself here when that happens. In single family residential, most people skip it anyway. There's nothing stopping you saying, hey, by the way, single family, putting it in there. But
The point is, you should always put it in, but if we're selling a single family home and it's zoned single family,
then you're covered by the language that's written in the agreement. It's when we get into the condos. We've seen this backfire on people in condos because the property was not solely, zoned for single family. It was
And
zoned
if
for
it's-
multifamily.
and in the case where like you're selling a condo that maybe it was zoned single family, but they had gotten a variance approved or something like that, do you have to make any of that clear?
If I was the listing agent, Greg, I would clear the waters up just personally. That would be me, because it talks about, is zoned solely and primarily, but there was a variance that came into play. That's where we get a little bit muddy. But again, I'm not a lawyer, but I would do it to protect my seller as much as possible. And I might put zoned RSA 5 with variance for 3 condo units, blah, blah, blah.
Got it.
Something to CYA. And of course, take this paragraph back to your manager and your broker and have the conversation with them, how they would want to handle it. But it's one of the sleeper paragraphs. It's only 4 lines, but gives the buyer an out, and it gives the buyer the ability, because the contract is voidable at their discretion at any time.
Thank you.
So it's a tough one.
Bruce Benjamin again. I'll say,
Hey,
like,
Bruce.
part of the issue is zoning and use permits are 2 different things in Philadelphia, at least, so they can conflict. And this really just addresses zoning. So I agree.
Correct.
It could be a multifamily that has commercial or residential or anything zoning and a completely different use in Philly.
Absolutely. But you're always better, Bruce,
Yeah.
CYA.
Yep.
Because the last thing, because now we all know the seller will not turn around and blame themselves, correct? All right. So looking at the inclusions. All right, looking at the inclusions. We also, there's several things in here. Keeping in mind, it's the drapery, like the rods, not the actual drapes themselves. I'm trying to think what is the other one. You can have the electric fence, but you can't have the collar that goes with it. There's certain things in there. The other thing is vacuum systems. You get all the attachments to it. Now, the other thing that we put in here, unless stated otherwise, the following items are included in the sale at no additional cost. Agents are always putting in there, you know, washer, dryer, refrigerator, no additional cost. Well, you're repeating yourself because it's actually already written into that paragraph. And I've actually won several arguments against the mortgage companies when they're like, well, we have to remove them because they're additional. I was like, no, right above it, line 83 clearly says it, no additional cost. Now, the other thing under C is when you get into things that might not be owned by the seller, anybody running into solar, you know, solar comes into play. Is that leased? Is it not? You know, what is it subject to? Propane tanks are another one. Water treatment systems may not be owned. So keep that in mind. And then if there's anything excluded. Now, this always comes up in the argument. Well, the seller said it was included in the MLS, or it used to be the argument that it was on the seller's disclosure. None of that matters. What matters is what's in the agreement between the buyer and the seller that's been signed. So keep that in mind. Any questions on 7 before we roll into good old 8? All right.
I'm just not seeing where the refrigerator is in there. I'm one of those
It's
people
not.
that's
It's not.
Okay.
You would put so refrigerator, washer, dryer, they're all items that are typically put in on line 84 and 85. But Faith, what we see a lot of is agents put washer, dryer, refrigerator at no additional cost. You don't need to put the additional language of at no additional cost because it's right on line 83.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah. I mean, we actually had to include radiator covers in the inclusions because people were walking off with radiator covers. Because technically, you think about them, most of them are not nailed down. You can just slip them off. So another thing in here on line 81 to 82, this used to be on the second page, is now on this page. Any remaining heating and cooking fuels stored on the property at the time of settlement. If you have that oil tank, propane tank, etc., whatever fuel is left in it stays. All right. Sorry, I was just looking at the notes to see. Okay. All right, so newest change, dropping like it's hot in a couple days. So on Friday, it's going to drop it like it's hot, is paragraph 8. So there's a little bit of change to paragraph 8, just some moving around. So one of the major things that we saw was that agents felt that when this waived box was checked, it meant that everything after it was waived, and that actually was not true. So after consulting with the attorneys and going back and forth, we moved around the paragraphs, we'll say. So the mortgage contingency can be elected or waived under F now, and the other items are, information talking in reference to when the buyer's applying for the mortgage within so many days, the buyer locking in their interest rate within so many days before settlement. If the mortgage lender, casualty insurance provider, they get to go in and take a look. And if they have issues within 5 days, giving that information back and forth. Wesley, always underneath the time is of the essence, it's calendar days, not business days. So as the contract is written without any alterations or adjustments, it is always on calendar days. So even if it's a holiday, it counts. Good question. So loan to value ratio. The other thing is when it comes to FHA and VA, you cannot waive the appraisal, if this makes sense. So if you're doing an FHA or a VA mortgage, the buyer cannot in advance agree to make up the difference. They can't waive their right to terminate in advance because that's not how VA and FHA go. Any questions so far on this? Okay. Then we get into the mortgage. Okay, so Buyer who waives this contingency but applies for loan costs or repairs can still terminate. Yeah. So Mark, I actually brought that up. We're going to talk about that and see if it's something that might need to be adjusted. So in reference to this, you are correct. As it's written right now, it talks about repairs and talks about negotiation between the two parties. I mean, if the seller chose not to have that in there, they could strike the paragraph out. And that is one way to do it. But the thing is this paragraph hasn't changed. It's been in the agreement. And unfortunately, what we had was a common misconception that if the buyer, waived the mortgage contingency, it didn't mean the other things didn't apply. And that wasn't the intention. So it just means that the deal is not contingent upon the buyer getting a mortgage.
If I may, I would be willing to bet that a heck of a lot of agents were not aware that the repairs still applied, even if the contingency was waived before. And, does that end up meaning that waiving the mortgage contingency is kind of only a partial waiver on the buyer's ability to qualify, not a waiver on the property condition? What if well, anyway, that's.
So, and trust me, I read the Facebook posts. I don't always comment. I read Facebook posts. I read, the blogs. We check in with legal and talk about, what's going on with the hotline, and this is one of the things, it's on my list of, okay, I'll make a note of this one and have a conversation about it. But it was one of the common misconceptions, because all this information came after the checkbox, that a lot of agents just assumed. And we all know what happens when we assume stuff,
Yeah.
it becomes an issue. So we thought,
Yeah.
okay, let's try and change this around. And of course, this particular housing, I don't know, bubble, I don't know what we want to call it, brought to light a bunch of different things that y'all were doing that we never even thought of, that made us go, wait a minute, we might need to adjust this, because we had a lot of people waiving, but then they were trying to back out and they were still trying to get the mortgage, but the seller's like, well, you waived it. And it's like, well, yeah, I did, but I still could get it. It's just not contingent upon it. I mean, it became this whole back and forth. So we did find out that there were a lot of people under the misconception that the other items did not apply. And then, I mean, there were people doing things with FHA that, we're just going to say, hopefully we corrected them in enough advance that they didn't get in trouble. But Mark, your question is on my list to talk to them about. Greg and then Jack.
So on the same topic at line 104. It's talking about appraisers and inspectors. My question is, I had a deal where I was representing buyers a few months ago where we basically waived everything, and they were still taking out a mortgage. So when it came time for like access for the appraisal and stuff like that,
All right.
but I wanted to know, would we have been allowed to just bring a home inspector as well, or only if the lender and or appraiser was requiring it?
Okay, so, and see, Greg, this is my one point as to how there was a lot of creativity that took place during this time. I mean, this is where we look at, we had to start taking a look at the agreement from a different perspective, because agents, I waived the inspection, but I need to, but I want to get an inspector in there.
Right.
To my
and the sellers were
knowledge,
fully restricting us from having any access whatsoever. It was like pulling teeth to get.
well, of course, because in their mind, you waived the mortgage, or you waived this or whatever. So yes, welcome to the muddy waters, and we try to clear it up as much as we possibly could. So when it comes down to this, we're looking at this particular section. When it talks about inspectors, appraisers, municipal officers, surveyors, it's as may be required by mortgage lender. So insurers or representatives as may be required by mortgage lenders to surveyors, municipal. So it's not necessarily pointing to home inspectors. So I'm going to make a note that maybe we need clarity on line 104, just to, sorry, I'm just making a note. because I mean, that's where we have, like I said, some muddy waters, you know,
Got it.
does that make sense? But that wasn't its intention because it's underneath the mortgage paragraph.
So the intention is simply, seller's obligation is to provide access to whoever, if an appraiser or if an insurer or lenders is seeking it.
Right, so here's the thing, we had an issue with Irma. We were under contract with these properties and you might have gotten your clear to close, but now there was like a little asterisk and all of a sudden the bank wanted to send out an inspector to make sure the house was still standing.
There.
You know, and that is a prime example of they're sending out, they're not a surveyor. They weren't, you know, a appraiser. They were just somebody inspecting and putting an eye on the house to make sure that it wasn't underwater, and they were going to make a loan on a house that in a 100-year flood situation, you know, was underwater.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Jack?
Good morning, Heather.
Morning.
I think line 104, I see it's in red, but we've always had that before. What are the wording has changed, particularly it's inspectors or surveyors, looks different to me.
Yeah, so there's some changes between, I'm sorry, I'm getting some wind in the background, Jack. I'm gonna put you on mute for a second. So there's changes, anything, you know, it's just been moved. Red is new and blue is moved. So if that's usually where it's coming from. And so Matt just put in the chat the GPAR 15 list. He has a link in there about the list. So, but yeah, you're talking about the changes. So blue is moved, red is new. So like the word above is new, the P in property is new, the 1 and 2 are now new. So yeah, Greg, you just brought up a point where I need to possibly make it known that it's inspectors for the bank.
Okay, but we've had
The blue stuff,
the wording.
Jack, the blue stuff.
Yeah, the
Most-
blue's been moved. I'm referring to 104 as red.
Right.
Didn't we have something like that before?
We did, but there had to have been some change to it. Usually red means that there's some new stuff in there.
Right. What did we add? Surveyor?
I'd have to go in and look in my
Okay,
notes.
that's right.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what we changed.
Yeah,
All
that's
right,
right.
so everybody knows you can always go to parealtor.org, sign in with your NERDS number and a password, go to member information, go down to standard forms, and you have access to the entire forms library. Rose, the new form will not appear anywhere until July 1st in your access of if you use zip forms or if you use .loop or if you use whatever other form service out there, you won't see a copy of this until July 1st. So on July 1st, it's dropping like it's hot in your electronic forms library. Right now, you can go to PAR and look up sample versions of it. So it won't be there. It won't be available for you to write and use until July 1st. So we usually drop around midnight. All right. Trying to think if there's anything. I mean, buyer and seller understand that the waiver of this contingency does not restrict buyer's right to obtain mortgage financing. We had those language in there before. Let's say we tweaked that one. Nothing other than that really has changed too much in here other than the look of it. There is nothing in the agreement of sale that gives the buyer the right to terminate if the property does not appraise. There is nothing in the agreement of sale that gives the buyer the right to terminate if the property does not appraise. That is why we have an appraisal contingency addendum to the agreement of sale. We wouldn't have an addendum if it was in the agreement.
I thought that the loan to value ratio covered that.
So Ariel, you are bringing up a very good point, and all the loan to value does is say that the buyer must get the mortgage based on these terms and conditions, but specifically pointing out that the appraisal comes in low. All right. does not give the buyer the right to terminate. You cannot terminate because the appraisal is low. The buyer could terminate should they not get their mortgage. However, you are looking at going all the way to the end of settlement to then terminate the agreement. There are agents who try to terminate the agreement mid-agreement, but the way that the paragraph is written is that the buyer is doing everything they possibly can to move forward with settlement. And if they are not victorious by the date of settlement and they did not get their mortgage, they get the loan denial or whatever it is, then you're terminating.
I have a question. I was on a call last week when they went over all the forms, and she specifically said, like, I guess it was the lawyers that came up with these forms. She specifically said that the mortgage contingency never has and still continues to not give the buyer the right to terminate if they cannot obtain a mortgage. And I was like, I thought that's exactly what it did. She said it never has. She said
there's a common misconception, Alana, that the buyer, can just walk away right away. And that's a common misconception. The language that's in there, and this is one of the paragraphs that, I mean, in all honesty, how often have you guys read this paragraph front to back and read every term and condition in it? It's not often. Unfortunately, we fill in the box, we check the box, and we, figure this is how it goes because that's how somebody else told you how it goes, and it's not correct. The way that this is set up, it's saying that the buyer will obtain a mortgage and do everything they possibly can to obtain a mortgage at these terms and conditions. And if they can't, then they can terminate. But when they terminate, it's at settlement, because we could not perform. We could not get to settlement. So
Heather, I was on that same call last week. I think this is where the confusion is. The point here, and I'm not an attorney, is that the buyer can never terminate if they can't get a mortgage.
No, well, let me just be clear on this. The buyer can terminate the agreement at any point in time that they want.
They would lose their.
I just want to make sure we are 100% clear. The buyer and the seller both have, and they could try and terminate at any point. Now, whether or not there would be consequences or whatnot, that's up to, lawyers and mediators, et cetera. So there's what we have been finding is that agents are looking at the loan to value ratio and saying, well, the property didn't appraise, so the buyer can, get out of the contract because we can terminate based on the fact that the property did not appraise. No.
But what that does is that if it doesn't appraise and you have the loan to value ratio, then the buyer cannot get a mortgage because the calculation for the loan to value ratio blows up.
And that would be understandable. However, there are two things. One, the buyer doesn't turn over a mortgage commitment because they can't. And then that is the only trigger in the agreement of sale that gives the seller the right to do what? To terminate, right? So the buyer doesn't turn over a mortgage commitment because the buyer can't get the mortgage, so there's no commitment to be given because it's not working, right? So then the seller can terminate. However, there's nothing in this paragraph that says the buyer can terminate because of that. They'd have to ride the wave until settlement.
Exactly. So if the buyer terminates because they can't get a mortgage, they run the risk of losing their deposit.
Absolutely. They run the risk of, yes, a lot of potential things. Yes, Naomi, correct. If you want to protect the buyer and be extremely clear and say, listen, I want my buyer to have an out should this property not appraise, you use the appraisal contingency addendum, the ACA, and elect option 1 and say this property must appraise for X, Y, and Z. And then it's clear as day. If this property doesn't appraise, we're out, or we'll try and negotiate with the seller.
Okay, so I have a question then. So you don't use the appraisal contingency, you fill this out correctly, you have the correct loan to value rate, and it appraises for $2,500 below the agreed upon price. They're approved for a mortgage. They can afford it. It doesn't affect their thing. So you're saying there's nothing the buyer can do if the lender shows up with a mortgage commitment on time. saying,
If-
it appraised for less, but you're still good to go on this loan. You're saying we're not covered and that LTV rate now means nothing?
No, because I didn't say that. The
Okay.
loan to value ratio. Okay, the loan to value ratio is what comes into play. The deal was contingent upon that loan to value ratio. Okay. What I'm saying is you cannot terminate during the contract, like right in the middle of the deal saying, well, it didn't appraise, so my loan to value's off. There are a lot of different moving parts, and Bruce, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
It could come into play where the seller turns around and literally says, well, buyer, you told me you had $1.5 million in your BFI, so you could settle.
Right. So
And I mean, there could be arguments for everything. You hire an attorney and I'll hire one to oppose your review.
right. So the buyer really is stuck, I mean, what are they, and suppose it does affect their loan, are they supposed to go get another appraisal from
Well,
somebody else? Is that the definition?
yes.
of doing
I
a
mean,
premium interest, going to another
they could
lender?
try everything else. They could try
Yeah.
and argue the appraisal. They can try and continue to, make application. Maybe there's another mortgage company. Maybe it's another appraiser, and that's the whole thing. It comes into play between the two parties, as to what happens. But, unfortunately, what ends up happening, underneath of C4 here, by the way, 197, if this agreement is terminated pursuant to paragraph 8F2, where the mortgage loan is not obtained for settlement, all deposit money is returned to the buyer. So you have to be careful though, when you go to terminate this. What we were finding was agents were terminating on the basis of the appraised value. Okay.
Yep.
And that was a problem.
Well, that shouldn't matter because the termination form says, we're terminating based on this, including but not limited to whatever. So it basically covers the whole agreement.
Right. Well, do yourself before you throw terminations out. All right. It clearly says even on the termination that they should consult an attorney to make sure that they have the right to terminate. All right. So keep that in mind. Greg, did you have a question? Then I have Ariel, then I have Tim.
Yeah, I did. So on this topic, a couple things. Number one, so you're representing the buyer, the place comes in $10,000 under the purchase price. Number one, if obviously buyer still has an obligation to do everything they can to appeal the appraisal, whatever. If seller is agreeable to lowering the purchase price to the appraised value, does that automatically obligate the buyer to stay in the transaction? Or is the buyer, if they wanted to exit the transaction, still able to do so and get their money back? Because even though the LTV is in line, the loan amount is now going to be different.
Well, so I mean, here's the thing, Greg. I cannot solve all the world's problems. But if the buyer, so let's be honest, if the buyer wanted to buy this property and it came in 10,000, the buyer's like, yeah, that's cool. Do a change in terms. Correct everything and adjust everything accordingly on a change in terms addendum. Very rarely do I ever see a buyer come in and be like, oh, it appraised $10,000 less and the seller's willing to come down. No, I changed my mind. But, I guess we shall see. But, I don't even know where to begin with that, Craig.
Okay.
I've been dealing with, what if it comes in over asking? How can the buyer pay this, or it comes in under, but the buyer's willing to pay more?
If
All
you
right.
don't mind, I have a
Hold on one
question.
sec. Well, I've got two people in front of you.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No problem. So Ariel, Alona, and I'm trying to keep up.
Yes,
with the chat.
please. Okay, so first of all, I mean, we all know that like when we throw an appraisal contingency addendum, people like start to get scared. It seems like this should be updated. Just throwing that out there to reflect that the buyer can get out of it if their loan to value ratio is off. But also like with regard to like, sorry to kind of switch topics, but the termination as it relates to this, if both parties sign off on it and it's mutually accepted, then doesn't that cover everybody?
For this?
Like, yeah, if you terminate because of the mortgage, like the whatever reason, but for this specifically, wouldn't that then, and both parties sign off on it?
So
Isn't
in
it
it, so
mutually
a term,
accepted?
so common misconception is that a termination is a two-way street. The termination form is one. There's only one terminating party. So you never get the other side to sign off and agree, in essence, Ariel.
But if you do the termination and release,
So the release is separate. The release deals with the deposit. The termination is one-sided.
right?
That's why there's a dark line between,
Yep.
let me see, the TERAREL form. So we only put those two forms on one page because we would have agents sending a termination, but never sending a release, or vice versa. We've had agents send a release and seller signed off, but the deal wasn't terminated because there was no termination.
But if the
So-
seller signs off
Signs off on what though? The
to
seller-
release the funds,
Well, the funds are different from termination. That's why you have to treat them as two separate things. So there's the terminating party and then there's the funds.
also a form that should be changed. Just throwing
okay.
it out there.
As what, into two separate forms?
No, I mean, I guess that both parties should sign the termination and it's mutually agreed upon because
But they're not both terminating. That's we thought about that too. So
Well, but
there is
they're-
only one party who's ringing the termination bell.
correct, but the other party is accepting that termination and
Not
Signing off on it.
necessarily, no.
So if
Well,
if I may,
no,
I'm
I don't
sorry, I
want you
think
to-
that there's a confusion between what her question is. I think she's saying that by signing the release of the monies as a quasi part of the termination, that would take away the seller's right to dispute the
No,
termination
and that's what
after the fact.
Steve, that's what I was about to get into. Just because.
Yeah, I think that's what she was
Yeah,
saying.
just because the buyer's terminated does not mean that the seller has agreed to the termination, and don't get the release signed off on as confusion. Trust me, there can.
but that's what I'm saying. I think that there should be a form that exists that says, okay, we accept you terminating and therefore we release you because, yeah, that's all.
I've written down your suggestion that you want an acknowledgement of termination.
Yes, thank you
Okay.
so much.
No problem. I've got that. It's on my notepad.
Okay.
Okay, but just to be clear, on the termination form, it is only one-sided. There's only one party terminating, okay? Because trust me, I've seen the buyer terminate and then the seller terminate. And I mean, it's like, yes, it could go back and forth. So there's only one party terminating and then the release is separate. That's why there's a dark line on that page. They're treated as separate forms. All right, Alana?
Yes.
Alona?
All right. So back to this paragraph. So I guess that there's more confusion with them. Okay, so let's take away the loan to value ratio, and that's the reason that we're terminating because it didn't appraise. What if they just couldn't get a mortgage? Like, what is because maybe they lost their job? I don't know. What is the protection and also release of funds that they have in this paragraph if this is not the purpose of the paragraph?
All right, well, so the purpose of the paragraph is saying, hey, seller, I'm going to make this deal contingent that I got to go get a mortgage.
Yeah,
And under
so
these terms
what
and conditions. And I'm
and
going
I
to do
think
everything I
everyone-
possibly can to make this
to get a
happen,
mortgage.
including but not limited, not losing my job on purpose.
Yeah.
All
So
right,
if
or not,
someone cannot get a mortgage, like just legitimately cannot get a mortgage, in this paragraph, are there protections for them to get their deposit monies
yeah,
returned?
yes.
Okay.
Yes, there are. And that's the whole thing. There are protections. What we're confusing things with is the fact that agents in most recent times have turned around and tried to terminate based on the appraisal. Okay, this is where we need to clean up the confusion here, is that it was based on the appraisal. And they can't terminate based on the appraisal in this paragraph. They would have to have used an appraisal contingency addendum if they wanted to be able to terminate based on the appraisal. Now the buyer would have to continue to move forward to make every good faith effort, et cetera. And to address your question in reference, like the buyer lost their job, there's actually language in there you need to alert the other side that happened.
Heather, can I add one other point?
Naomi, hold on. I've got Aileen in front of you.
Is it my turn?
Yep.
Okay.
And then
Oh, by the
Naomi,
way,
I'll come
I'm
back to you.
Mark. I'm Mark. I'm on my wife's computer.
Okay, hey, Mark.
Showing up as Aileen. I've got a similar question. We're all concerned about interest rates right now. And we've got those in the terms, the financing terms. So let me throw a hypothetical. We put in there that the interest rate of 5%, not to exceed, say, a maximum of 5.5%. But then interest rates go up. And when we get towards closing, it's at 6%. But the bank is still saying, hey, we'll approve this loan at 6%. Is there a protection in here because the rate has gone over 5.5%?
And that all falls back onto, yes, the deal was contingent upon us getting X, Y, and Z.
Okay, but
So
we
that's-
still have to go to settlement date.
Well, so here's the thing though, and it was Mark, right?
Yes.
Okay, so Mark, you as an agent, so it goes up to 6% and you're at 5.5. You cannot terminate until you go through line 178, 79, and 80 first.
Okay.
Okay, which gives actually, so what it says is, buyer gives the right to guarantee the interest rate and fees above or below maximum level stated. Buyer gives seller the right at seller's sole option and as permitted by mortgage lender to make the above mortgage terms available to the buyer. So the seller could turn around and be like, listen, I got to get out of this house, and to pay a half a point to get them down to where they want to be, I'm good for it. Here's $3,000.
Oh, okay.
So what I'm saying is, as agents, we have to be very careful that just because it didn't fit in that box, you need to make sure you've read everything, understand everything, have given, done everything you were supposed to do on that. And it's not always as cut and dry as we unfortunately have made it. Because this does, and we've seen this, was it in the 90s? It was the early 90s, late 80s, where sellers were paying to buy down the interest rate for the buyers because they needed to get out of the property.
Heather,
So it could rear its ugly head. Greg, 1 second. I got Naomi in front of you.
Okay.
So be careful, Mark, if if the interest rate does go above what the maximum was, that the buyer has agreed in writing, and as long as it was okay with the mortgage lender, that the seller could contribute to make those terms available.
Cool.
All
Thank
right,
you.
Naomi, go for it.
I just wanted to add all that confusion about buyers not being able to terminate appraisal, loan to value, all of it. The seller can terminate. So have a discussion with the listing agent and let the listing agent know you can't move forward, and the seller can terminate.
Once they pass that date, yes. Once you pass the commitment date, or whatever they're calling it these days, whatever your bank is calling it, yes, you are correct. It's a conversation. Like, listen, we're going to continue to exhaust all possibilities, but this is probably not going to happen. And the seller may turn around and be like, forget it. I just don't want to waste any more time. Let's, send us the termination and release and let's move on. Or you might have a seller who says, no, then, what's their rates? Because I can contribute. What do we got? Let me deal with it. Who knows? It's communication. But the one key thing is most definitely 100%, I can't say it anymore, is you cannot terminate based on appraisal in this paragraph. Now, the other terms and conditions, if something should happen, the interest rate rises, the buyer loses their job, they get a denial, et cetera, we're going to keep going, until we can. All right. I had Naomi, Greg.
Thank you. Yeah. So along the same point that Mark was making, does the buyer have an obligation to lock their rate within a certain time frame?
Yes.
After going under contract? Because if you go under contract and the max interest rate was 5.5 and rates at the time of going under contract were at 5, and then the buyer waits 2 weeks and all of a sudden they're up at 6.
Yeah. So before I get to that point, we're going to get to, I'll roll back up to that. So, when we talk to the seller's right to terminate, which falls underneath of 3, which is 91 through 96, highlighted in the red, until seller terminates his agreement pursuant to this paragraph, buyer must continue to make good faith effort to obtain mortgage financing. Further saying, termination of this agreement by buyer due to the mortgage lender's denial of buyer's mortgage application may demonstrate bad faith by buyer and result in the forfeiture of deposit monies to seller. So make sure, like, when we say you have to continue to do everything you possibly can, you have to continue to do everything you possibly can to get the mortgage. And in some cases, it's just not going to happen. You know, the buyer's just going to keep getting denied over and over and over again. Greg, to your point, this was put in a couple years ago. The two things that were put in is one, that the buyer has to make application, because that stopped buyers from shopping around forever and ever. And number two, on its A4, if mortgage lender gives buyer the right to lock in interest rates at or below the maximum levels desired, buyer will do so at least 15 days before settlement.
Got it. So that means but the point is they can wait as long as they want. And if they're basically rolling the dice, hoping rates go down and then rates go up instead. And
you could have the seller have a good argument and again, hire an attorney to argue their point. I mean, this is welcome to, you know, any possible, you know, and that's the whole thing as an agent, you know, you want to find out, did they lock in? Did they lock in? Have they locked in yet? I mean, 15 days before settlement, if they don't lock in 15 days before settlement, are they breaking one of the terms and conditions of the agreement?
So as a listing agent, let's say it's a 45-day contract period and you receive an offer that you're willing to accept, but you're recognizing the fact that rates appear to be going up. Can you basically change that number from 15 to 40 days to require them to lock their rate within the first 5 days of the contract period?
So anything, I don't want to say yes or no, but what I would say is everything in the agreement is negotiable between the buyer and seller, and please consult an attorney, your broker and manager. So that time frame was put in there, and actually, you know, I'll make a note. Should it be changed?
Like maybe instead of before settlement, it should be within 10 days of going under agreement or something like that. I mean, I guess that's also hard because if it's like a long-term rate lock or something like that.
I mean, so just to be clear, PAR takes all of your suggestions seriously, and so does the committee. It does go in front of the committee for consideration by agents who use this form throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So I've made several notes here to take back to them. I mean, obviously it's not my decision, it's the committee's decision as to, you know, what they think is, hey, we should look at that again, or hey, this should change. So that does come into play. Hold on one second. Currently, just stop using appraisal. So Yogi, the appraisal contingency addendum, if used, does give, and you choose option 1, does give the buyer the right to terminate or negotiate. It does not give the seller the right to negotiate. So it gives the buyer the clear right to negotiate if they so choose, but it also gives them the clear right to terminate. All right, Matt.
I just want to make a specific mention of this. When Heather's talking about the committee, that's the Standard Forms Committee with the State Association, of which Heather is the chair of that committee.
No, we don't talk
about that. Just it's really awesome that we have this kind of connectiveness to that committee. And when she's saying, I'm going to jot this down, bring it to everybody's attention. It's wonderful that GPAR has that kind of connectiveness. We also have some other folks who sit on that committee from our association, including our president, Jake Markovitz. So I just wanted to like pitch that in there because it's important for our members to recognize that our voice is being heard, because, you know, some of this stuff you might feel like we're talking about zoning here in Philadelphia, and that might seem very different than what happens out in rural Pennsylvania. Those types of things are brought to the attention of those folks, and we're very fortunate to have that kind of representation out there. So just want to let you guys know your voice is being heard in Harrisburg.
So I'm all for the movement of the paragraph 8, because I think it's a paragraph that we have not dusted off in a while and read in a while. So I think it gives agents a good opportunity to be like, whoa, what happened here? Why does this look different? But keep in mind, when it comes, the reason why FHA and VA are in a box, it's because FHA and VA are mandated obviously by the government. They have their own rules and regulations. So we cannot change this is their language. We didn't write this. We just took their language and put it into the agreement of sale. So keep that in mind. You can't mess with their terms and conditions. You cannot take away their option to terminate a contract if it does not appraise. Now, if you notice within FHA and VA, it also gives them the right to negotiate if they so choose, but you can't take away their right to terminate. Okay. All right. What else do we have? Anything else on mortgage before we move forward? Okay. When we get into change of buyer status, this has been in here since 2018, most certainly as it is. Highlighting, letting know, like, the buyer understands that if you go ahead and apply, you go ahead and yes, you got the house and you started racking up furniture, all right, that it could affect your ability to purchase, which then can be an issue. So keeping that in mind. All right. Seller's representation in reference to status of water and sewer. The notices that are further beyond used to be on the back of the agreement of sale. And then we brought it to the front to try and get some clarity to make sure everybody understands what it means to have different types of sewage facilities in the area. And some of you might be saying, well, we don't need to deal with this. We always have public water, public sewer. Unfortunately, no, we don't in Philadelphia. And, you know, in our own city, we have people with septic tanks and holding tanks and disposal sites. So keep that in mind. Letter C is also another one that I see a lot, especially in the city, where properties have historic preservations on it, but they are not being transferred to the agreement of sale. So listing agents, don't just solely focus on the price and those terms. Make sure you're covering yourselves and filling in letter C here underneath of this paragraph if the historic preservation does exist. Make sure you're covering yourself. Okay. Land use, again, if the property was farmland or anything along those lines, or restrictions. Real estate seller's disclosure law lets them know, hey, make sure you have, you know, disclose everything and etc. Any questions on those? No? Okay. So look at 282. The real estate seller's disclosure law requires that before an agreement of sale is signed, before an agreement of sale is signed, the seller in a residential real estate transfer must make certain disclosures regarding the property to a potential buyer in a form defined by the law. Now we have the seller's property disclosure statement that is put out by PAR, and then there's the, you know, real estate commission's version, if that is used. I will also let you know that there's some confusion over the seller's disclosure as to what version can be used. There is a version out there that we can go back to and use that version or the ones after that and the new version, so they don't have to redo it. Well, we'll never say what version that is, but they should always use the most recent if they possibly can. The one thing we also get a lot of confusion on is that the buyer initials at the end of the agreement of sale saying they received the disclosure. That doesn't exist. What they initial at the end of the agreement of sale is that they received the lead, but not the seller's disclosure. So just a heads up. When we get into public and or private assessments, if you look at F2, seller knows of no other potential notices, including violations and or assessments except as follows. You ever have a dirty city cert? Anybody ever have a dirty city cert? The grass needed to be mowed, there's a violation ticket or several violations. This would potentially be a good spot to put it. You know, making sure everybody knows and understands what's going on. So if there are any, seller represents that as of the date they signed this agreement, no public improvement, condominium, homeowner association assessments. Again, you might have put it in the seller's disclosure, but you want to make sure you're covering yourself. Haven't been made against the property which were made unpaid, and that no notice by any government public authority has been served upon the seller or any seller on behalf, including notices relating to violations of zoning, housing, building, safety, fire, remain uncorrected. So even though you might have had your seller disclose it in the disclosure, they should also put it where? Okay, so listing agents, if you know you have that property that has those items, make sure you're putting it in the agreement of sale or see attached addendum or something along those lines, okay? Highway occupancy permit is another one that the state requires us to have. And then Internet of Things. So this was a new paragraph that came into play a couple years ago, just letting people know about, like, you got the devices in the property. If they're staying in the property, you need to disconnect them and disconnect yourself. Because, well, there were some sellers who were still controlling the thermostat just to mess with the buyers. Yeah. So. Make sense? All right. Let's talk about inspections. So if the agreement is contingent on buyer's right to inspect and or repair the property, all right, to verify insurability, environmental, boundary, certification, zoning, or any other information regarding property, buyer's failure to exercise any of buyer's options within the time is a waiver. And we agreed to the release in 28. Now, here comes the due diligence part. The buyer has the right to inspect the property. How many of you put a property under contract and then tell the listing agent when you're doing the inspections? Anybody ever do that? You say, okay, we're going to do the inspection on Thursday at 10 a.m. Anybody do that?
Yep, all the
Okay.
time.
All the time. You know the seller has the right to tell you no?
No, it did not.
And that's okay, Crystal. That's why we talk about these things. So it says that the seller will provide access, right?
Correct.
It also says that the seller can, only, so here, let's just start with this one. The seller will provide access. The seller will provide you access within the dates that you, which is in that time frame. It doesn't say they have to do it on the date that you want it, does it?
No, it
No.
doesn't.
So buyer's agents, selling agents, before you go ahead and schedule that inspection, check with the listing side first to make sure that that date and time is okay. Listing agents, you have every right to say, no, it's not a good time. And in some cases, come right up front and say, listen, the kids are home between 3 and 5 and they have, nap time between here and here. You can do the inspection on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday between 8 and 12. Yeah. So a lot of people just assume that the buyer has access unlimited to the property at any point in time during the, and we're just going to use 10 days because that's what the agreement says right now. So we'll just say 10 days. And that is not correct. If the seller wants to be a hard-nosed person, they can tell you, sure, you can have access on day 9 between the hours of 9 and 5. How many of you are now like, that sucks? That's okay. All right, let's take on to the next part, which is line 323, which continues to say, only parties and their real estate licensees may attend any inspection. Now, you have 2 people who are buying a property, but only one is on the agreement of sale. Guess what? The other party can be denied from coming to the inspections. The listing agent has every right to be there. The seller has every right to be there during the inspections. Yeah. You know who doesn't have the right to be there? Mom, dads, brothers, uncles, cousins, family members 17 times removed who bought a house once. Without what? Unless otherwise agreed. Yeah. So unless otherwise agreed, only real estate agents and the parties to the contract can be at the inspections. Now, number 12A2, the buyer can make 2 pre-settlement walkthrough inspections for the limited purposes of what? Determining that the condition of the property is required as the agreement of sale and any addenda. Now, the buyer's right to these in these pre-settlement inspections are not waived. So the right to these are not waived. So the buyer can actually do a pre-settlement walkthrough let's just say we get through a home inspection and the buyer only asks for $500 seller assist. The buyer still gets their 2 pre-settlement walkthroughs. Now, the buyer gets the 2 pre-settlement walkthroughs to make sure that the property is still in the same condition that it was when they put the property together, not to measure for furniture or bring a contractor or to have it measured for carpets or, to check paint swatches or whatever. That's not what that says. So keep that in mind. And obviously the seller has to keep all the utilities on, right? Oh, it's always a good one to make sure you point out.
So Heather, that specifies that they get 2 pre-settlement walkthroughs. That's in addition to the walkthrough that they did for like the purpose of the inspection, right?
Well, the inspection is totally different. The pre-settlement walkthrough is typically done after inspections. And the reason why we went with 2 pre-settlement walkthroughs, Faith, ended up because of TRID. When we had the 3 business day CD, finalization and everything, and there was no more at the settlement negotiating numbers. It was to try and stop that from happening. So if there were repairs that were supposed to be done to the property within X amount of days before settlement, this would give the buyer an option to go and make sure that they were done. And if they weren't done, you had plenty of time to correct it in advance. So what has also ended up in this case is when buyers have been waiving the inspections, they still get their 2 pre-settlement walkthroughs. So they're
Cool.
not waived.
That's how I've been using it, but
Yep.
you
Yeah,
made me
but-
second guess myself for a second.
No. They still get their 2 pre-settlement walkthroughs, but again, it's only for the limited purpose to determine that the condition is still in the same condition. It's not to bring family and friends back and check paint chips and measure for carpet. No, it's like, is the house still standing and does it look the way it was supposed to look? And a lot of buyers use that during Irma to go and make sure that the house did not get flooded, and the seller quickly painted the walls. So it doesn't waive their 2 pre-settlement walkthroughs.
Got it.
So just a reminder that the most recent forms will not be on your zip forms or dot loop or wherever until July 1st. If you want to see a sample copy, you have to go to par.org, parealtor.org, sorry. All right. So line 5 of this, which is, line 331, which is paragraph 5, seller has the right upon request to receive a free copy of any inspection report from the party for whom it was prepared, unless otherwise stated. Seller does not have the right to receive a copy of any lender's appraisal report. Now, of course, if you're using the appraisal contingency addendums, it could be different language. However, this language was put in there because of the home inspector's law. So letting them know, like, you have a right to receive it. Now, of course, some of you are going to bring it up that we get into the next paragraph, but we'll get there soon. All right. So when we talk about buyer waiving or electing their inspections, we have seen a lot of buyer is waiving the inspections and then agents putting underneath of paragraph 32B, inspections are for informational purposes only, or the buyer is electing home inspection, wood and termite, and then the agents are putting in paragraph 32B, inspections are for informational purposes only. Do me a favor, what does that mean? What does for informational purposes mean?
To me, it means that the findings will not be the basis for termination, right?
Okay. So the findings, whatever you find, you can't terminate, right?
Or hold the seller responsible for.
Or hold the seller responsible. So you can't terminate or hold the seller responsible. Go ahead, Naomi.
Actually, in my opinion, I'm not a lawyer, it means nothing. So if it's for informational purposes, then strike out that portion of the agreement of sale.
So Naomi, welcome to why I have 15 extra gray hairs over this last 2 years of selling with agents. And here's the reason why, because remember, we try, and I understand you're trying to get your client's offer accepted, and you told your client, listen, you'll do the inspections, but you're not going to ask the seller for anything and blah, 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 blah. But you didn't touch paragraph 13. So paragraph 13 is still in its full written context.
Right, so.
So now what?
It's 13.2B, I think. I'm not 100% sure, but I strike that entire paragraph out.
So this is, so let's talk about that. So 13 talks about, okay, you have a contingency period to doing some inspections. You have, if you pass your contingency period, you accept the property with the, if you haven't done one of the three things, accept, terminate, or negotiate. So if you're trying to do it for informational purposes only, strike out 13B, 3, and 2. If the buyer's not going to terminate and they're not going to renegotiate, but they're going to just do it within X amount of days, and the seller knows exactly what inspections are being done at exactly how much of a time period the buyer is going to do it in, then they're accepting it after those 10 days are over, or 5 days, or 3 days, or whatever. So Naomi, you're onto something. Yes. In order to convey that, because when you add something in 32B, it doesn't take away anything that's already written and agreed upon before. You're adding to it. Like if you want to change something, you do an addendum. In some cases, you want to strike things out. So talk about this paragraph with your broker and manager and go over some different scenarios. Because if you're trying to convey to the seller, I want to do inspections on your property, and these are the inspections I want to do, but I'm taking your property no matter which way I find it. Or what if the buyer says, I'll take it or leave it. I won't ask for any additional money. I'll either move forward or I'll walk away. Then there goes 13B what? 3. Yeah. You're not adding any language. You're just taking away the contingency. Now, some of you may also mention, well, whatever happened to, the deductible? So at one point in time in our inspection section, there was a deductible amount that the buyer would accept the property as long as the deduction, was no greater than blah, blah, blah. Problem is, I can easily hit $5,000 in just a blink of an eye once the home inspector says that the heater is beyond its life expectancy. It's not dead, but it's beyond its life expectancy. It became an argument back and forth between, the reason why it was taken out was because it became an argument back and forth between the seller saying, well, I can get that done for cheaper, so it's under your underneath of your deductible, and the buyer saying, well, mine's over. Well, then whose wins? All right, I've got Alona, either your hand is still up or you've got a question, and if not, Kalia. All right, Kalia.
Yeah, so if we can just go back to the question, the statement about the home inspection, and like generally what I do at the very bottom, I put home inspection, is for informational purposes only. And what my understanding is, even though they're stating that, they could still terminate. So what I wanted to be clear on, because I know you said if they don't plan on terminating and they truly are moving forward, to X out those certain paragraphs, but can I still leave that statement in? And then in fact,
well, here comes the question. What's the purpose of the statement?
It's to okay, well then maybe I need to rephrase that paragraph on the bottom where it says additional information. Maybe I should put, or maybe let me ask you, should I just put the buyer is accepting the home in as is condition?
But what's as is? So when the buyer signs this agreement, there actually is a section that says the buyer is accepting the property in its current condition as it is right this second. The question becomes, we as agents, what are you trying to convey? Like, what are you ultimately trying to say? If you're trying to say that the buyers they want an opportunity to do a home inspection and a termite and a radon and whatever else they want to do, just because they want to know what they're getting into once they go to settlement, where they have to spend their money, then adjust paragraph 13 accordingly. If the buyer says, well, I want to do them so I have information, but I want to be able to get out of the deal if I don't like what it says, but I don't want to renegotiate, then adjust the paragraph accordingly. If the buyer's like, I want to be able to try and renegotiate or terminate or accept it if I want, then leave it as it is. Where all of you out there in this magical world of real estate came up with this informational purposes only statement, I'll never know. because nobody has been able to give me an exact definition as to exactly what it means and get everybody to agree. It's not in our contract. It's not something that we've all agreed to. The question then becomes what your interpretation of it informational purposes only is, what the seller's interpretation of informational purpose only is. It becomes very, cloudy. And then the seller's agent might say to the seller, oh, well, they're just going to do them and they're not going to ask for anything. Well, 13 wasn't touched. So technically the buyer's like, peace out, Girl Scout. I don't have to buy your property, So, okay, now we got everybody raising their hands.
So
on
wait,
this one.
I'm sorry. Like, just so then to be clear, if my client is just wanting to convey, we're not going to ask you guys to make any repairs, credits, or concessions, then leave, you're saying paragraph 13 alone, correct?
No, because if you read this, 13B says the buyer has 3 options within the time period. They can accept the property the way they found in the report. They can terminate and walk away and get their deposit back, or they can negotiate. If your client is saying, I want the option to either stay or go, but I won't negotiate with the seller, then remove the negotiation portion.
Makes sense. And is it still okay to put that statement at the bottom of the agreement of sale, like with that little empty paragraph line?
And my question still comes back to you. What the heck does it mean? I'm dead serious. It has come up several times as to what exactly does that mean? I mean, it's like saying, I like to wear red shoes.
It's just it's like an extra layer of
what?
Or for the seller, like, listen, we're just making sure that we're not going to ask you to fix anything.
But clear, in all honesty, by striking out 13, it clearly describes that the buyer within that time frame is going to accept it or terminate. That's it.
Got you. Okay. All right.
I mean, no, and it's not you. We have heard that paragraph over and over again. And every time we've asked somebody, what do you think it means? They're like, well, I think it means that the buyer is, going to do the inspections and we're moving forward. And then the buyer's agent's like, oh, no, we're going to do it. But if we don't like what we find, we want out. And it's like, well, wait a minute. We've got 2 different sides saying 2 different things. All right. I've got Misty, Ty, and then Crystal. Misty?
Sorry, I can't get to my mute button fast enough. So I'm a fairly new agent, and I'm just going to tell you what I was told that phrase meant. And it was in reference to as is properties. So
and this is why I always say, go back to your broker, go back to your manager, have this conversation with them, because even if you put in the back, the property is being purchased in as is condition, what does that mean? And again,
I totally agree with what you're saying. I completely agree with what you're saying, but that was the sentiment that I was getting from people when it related to as is properties.
Right. And this is one of those things where then you say as is, interpretation can be 2 different things. And I'll tell you right now, you have 4 people involved, and we'll just say 4 people. It's the listing agent, it's the selling agent, it's the buyer, and it's the seller. And all 4 of them can have different interpretations with what that means. And that's the whole thing. You need to be as clear as possible. And when we get to the inspection contingency, it is clear as day. I elect to do these inspections and I will have 3 options. If I choose to remove one of my options, then I have 2 options. If I remove 2 and I only have 1, then clearly within X amount of days, I'm moving forward. But I still get the right to do the inspections, and the seller knows exactly what inspectors are going to be throughout their house and coming to their property. So yeah, I mean, I would encourage you to go back and talk to your brokers and your managers about that too. Ty, and then Crystal, and then
Hey, Heather. I'm so confused because I thought that legally, because we are not lawyers, that we were not able to strike out anything.
No, that's not. So
really,
no, it's when we start to add things in.
Okay, because I can't remember the exact class that I was in not too long ago, and they specifically said to not strike out anything on the contract, but have the buyer do it.
Well, but that's the whole thing. The buyer is doing it, or the seller is doing it. I mean, we unfortunately are the catalyst between them, but they can, they can strike out terms and conditions. I would, take back what we're, conversing here back to your brokers and managers and let them, run it up the flagpole of their legal department and tell you how they want to handle it. All I'm
Okay.
saying to you is what we're seeing is when we get that terminology at the end of the agreement where an agent says is for informational purposes only, but paragraph 13 hasn't been touched, the listing side is assuming you're just doing it and we're moving forward. The selling side is thinking, oh no, we have the right to walk away or renegotiate, and it becomes confusion.
Got it.
So take this information. I fortunately get to hear across the state things that are happening and what people are saying. So this is one of those things where you think you might have clarity, but it might not necessarily be clear.
Got it.
So,
Thanks,
but definitely
Heather.
take it back and ask about,
Okay.
the, scratching out, et cetera, to clear.
Thanks,
Crystal,
Heather.
no problem. Crystal, then Rowan, Micah.
Yeah, I was going to pretty much say the same thing that Misty said, that I think the phrase came from the selling as is when the sellers would put it on the market as such. Now, my question is when they put that selling as is, because I've had people in my office say their interpretation of when a seller says selling as is that you can't get out of the contract even if you did a home inspection. So would that be one of those times you would strike certain things out, or I don't?
Well, so this is where it comes into play. If the paragraph 13 is left in full force and not changed or altered, and there's no other addendum that changes it whatsoever, then you go by the written contract.
Okay.
And this is where it becomes, when I sit down with the seller and they're like, I want to sell the property as is, I ask them clearly, what does as is mean to you? Well, I don't want to make any repairs. Okay, do you physically not want to make any repairs? But if a buyer comes back to you and asks for a credit, was that okay? Well, yeah, that's fine. Well, then is that as is?
Right.
So this is why we have such confusion over anytime, real estate agents start adding verbiage into 32B. It just becomes confusing because the contract is written. This is a paragraph that's written. It tells you what's going to happen based on paragraph above, right? And then you go to 32B and you start writing language and it gets confusing because what does it mean? All right, I've got Ro and then I've got Bruce.
Hi.
Hi, Ro.
Can you hear me? So as far as the informational purposes only, I agree that it means absolutely nothing. It's just a term that is popular, but I think it can be extremely dangerous using it just that without either clarifying. And so I think my question is that sometimes you want to emphasize or point out specifically what you're saying without using the wording. So is it appropriate can it be appropriate to put in that paragraph 32B to say, refer to paragraph 13, inspection contingency, and then strike that out?
I mean, again, I'm going to have to lead you to your broker, your manager on that one, because you're then taking a paragraph and sending them back to a paragraph. Like, what are you trying to say about that?
Just to emphasize and to say, hey, make sure you get this.
And sometimes in all cases, if I send a contract that we've stricken 13B3, I will put in a cover letter to an agent, my buyer's intentions are only to utilize option, B1 or 2.
Okay.
But again, it all depends on what you're trying to go for.
Okay.
All right, Bruce.
Thank you.
Bruce, what's up?
2 points. One, I'll just describe how I was taught as is. And the problem with as is, it's when. Because the buyer thinks it's the last time they were in the house, and the seller thinks it's a day of settlement, whether or not a tree fell on it that day. And that's where you run into trouble. Here's my question. So you have the inspection, 10-day, day 10 comes and goes, and you're the listing agent, you don't hear from the buyer's agent. What are your rights on day 11? What happens?
Well, as defined as long as nothing else has been touched or changed, then they're moving forward and they have agreed to the release.
Where does it say that?
Where does it say it in the contract? Okay, so the contingency period is 10 days from the execution of date elected in paragraph 10. Within the stated contingency period, they're going to do these things, okay? If buyer and seller do not reach a mutually acceptable agreement and buyer does not terminate this agreement by written notice to seller within the time allotted in 13B3, et cetera, it's over. But what it says here right there at the top, the contingency period is 10 days. If they breach that contingency period, they're accepting the property. It's an understood that within that time frame, they had to do one of these three things. If they choose not to do one of those three things, then
That's,
they move forward.
I don't see where it says if they don't do it. It says the things they will do.
And that's been brought up before.
Yeah.
And it's been, and I'll bring it up again to them, and say, hey, there's, concern that it's not clear enough. But in this case, the contingency period is 10 days. And if they don't do any of the three things within the contingency period, then they move forward.
Yeah, because that's how I think I've always understood it. And then we had that issue and couldn't find where it said seller can, that the buyer is accepting the property.
Yeah, I got you on that one.
It's not automatic. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's
Confusing.
automatic. It's automatically understood that if they're outside their contingency period, but I will bring it up again and say that, request for clearer language.
Thank you.
All right, let's talk about contingency time. All right, utilizing the 10, 5, and 2 that are in here. Just so we're clear, you have 10 days to do your inspection. And within, that's why it's highlighted, within the contingency period, you must do one of the three things. You either have to accept it, terminate it, or negotiate it. All right. So if you decide to negotiate, then it rings the bell for 5-day negotiation period. A couple things I want to run over here. Do you notice that in all three of these options, there's a bold statement that says present all reports in their entirety to seller? Do you see that? If you did a home inspection, a termite, and a radon inspection, but the radon was cool and the termite was good, you're no problem, and you only send the home inspection, are you following the contract as it's written? Are you assisting the buyer in potentially defaulting on the contract?
Yes.
Yeah. The clearly written words are all reports, not just the summary page, not just half the report, all reports. So keep that in mind. All right. So let's just say your buyers were really good and they got their home inspection done in 5 days. And they want to negotiate a new heater and a new hot water heater. So they submit a reply to the seller on day 6. How many days do they have to negotiate that request?
The remainder of the 10 days and the additional 5 days.
Correct. So they still left 4 days on the table, plus the 5-day negotiation. That's 9 days total. Okay. Because it clearly says on line 456, following the end of the contingency period. So following the end of the 10 days, buyer and seller will have 5 days for negotiation. Now, this is also where we've seen some issues. Okay, Kevin, if the agent asks not to send the reports, then what do you think you should probably have done to the agreement of sale to clearly define that you don't want the reports? Strike it out. Oh, by the way, it's also not the listing agent's request. It would be the seller's request, but keep that in mind. Strike it out. All right. So following the end of the contingency period, buyer and seller will have the 5 days to negotiate. So seller will either acknowledge the agreement to satisfy, or buyer and seller will negotiate another mutually acceptable written agreement providing for any repairs or improvements, credits, et cetera, blah, 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 as acceptable mortgage lender, if any. Now, if seller agrees to satisfy all terms of buyer's proposal, or buyer and seller enter into a mutually agreeable acceptance, blah, 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 they agree to the release and the negotiation period ends. So now we're in our 5 days of negotiation. Day 1, seller says, no, but I'll give you $400. And the buyer comes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And the buyer is getting fed up with the seller. Can the buyer terminate at any time during those 5 days of negotiation?
No.
Nope. The seller could come back on day 5 and agree to replace or repair or do whatever the buyer asked for. And the buyer is moving forward. The only time that the buyer has the option to terminate is once it moves into B, which is if there is no mutually acceptable written agreement or a seller fails to respond, then following the end of that negotiation period, the buyer will accept it or terminate it. So don't, during that time frame, be very careful, because we see agents try to terminate during that negotiation period, and you are potentially putting your clients in jeopardy of default. Okay. All right. Okay, sweet. Paragraph C deals with septic tanks and holding tanks, etc. Be very careful, agents, okay, buyer's agents specifically. If there is a, septic tank, holding tank, etc., and the report reveals, the need to expand or replace, the seller may within, and the default time frame is 25 days. If you're trying to do a 30-day settlement, you've just given the seller 25 days of receiving the report to submit a proposal to the buyer. Yeah. So be very careful. All right. Be very careful. Be very careful. All right. So got a question. Oh, so seller will acknowledge in writing sellers, where are we? When it comes, Michael, comes to buyer and seller will negotiate another mutually acceptable written agreement providing for any repairs to the property and or any credit as acceptable mortgage lender, if any. If seller agrees to satisfy all the terms of the buyer's proposal, or buyer and seller enter into a mutually acceptable agreement, then the buyer agrees to the release. Welcome to the gray area. That if the seller agrees to it, how can the buyer terminate if they're giving them what they want? All right, there's a question in reference to the reports. Hold on one second. Oh yeah, sorry, I got that one. All right, cool. Ty and Misty, I don't know if you still have questions or if your hands are still up, just double checking. All right.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know my hand was still up.
It's okay.
But
just
checking. I do have a question.
Go for it.
So I was always told that though during the first 15 days that a buyer could terminate, like if an agreement was not, mutuals, but you're saying that you have to wait until the end of those days to actually terminate?
So you're within the 5-day negotiation period, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what it's called. It's called a negotiation. You're going back and forth within that time frame. The buyer does not have any right to terminate during that time frame because they're negotiating. So if the buyer comes out and they're going back and forth and the seller says, well, what about this and what about that? Now, here comes another common misconception. And this falls on the buyer, the selling side, the buyer side, that unfortunately what we also see a lot of is, let's just say on day 5, the seller says, listen, I'll give you $3,500 in seller assist. And the buyer's agent goes, okay, well, we'll think about it. And then the buyer's agent turns around to the buyer and says, okay, we have 2 days to think about it. No, you don't. If you read B, it says if no mutually acceptable written agreement is reached, or if seller fails to respond during negotiation period, within 2 days following the end of the negotiation, the buyer will do one of 2 things: accept the property with the information stated in the reports and agree to the release, or terminate. It does not say agree to the seller's last offer, does it?
Got it.
So a lot of agents unfortunately think that they get 2 extra days to think about the seller's last offer. And we've had an instance where a seller turned around and said, no, you got an option: accept the way it is, as is, that you found in the reports, or terminate. $3,500 is off the table. And of course, again, we try to do our best possible, but unfortunately there are agents who are leading their clients down the road saying they have 2 days to think about accepting that offer. And the way that it reads, it doesn't say accept the seller's last offer. It says accept the property with the information stated in the reports and agree to the release.
Thanks, Heather.
So again, another paragraph, talk to your manager and broker about this paragraph. Just to make
honestly,
sure.
honestly, Heather, I feel like, I don't know, and this is like no disrespect to any brokers in the room or ABs, but a lot of the information that I know I received has been coming from my brokers. So I feel like maybe brokers should kind of have like these conversations and these Zooms just to always stay updated.
And that's why PAR did a brokers rollout, and also GPAR does brokers rollouts to try and get the information to the brokers and managers as best as we possibly can. Yeah.
Thanks, Heather.
Yeah, no problem. So Sharon, to answer your question, if buyer sends the inspection before the 10 days are up, technically the seller doesn't have to respond at all if they don't want to. I mean, the seller doesn't, you can't force the seller to reply to a request. The other thing is they could wait until day 9 or day 10 if they wanted to. There's nothing that says the seller has to respond to their request.
Heather, I can't find this. This is Deb Stanitz.
Hey, Deb.
Does the CIT then have to be signed at
y'all are
within
killing
that
me.
5-day period?
Okay, first of all, y'all are killing me. I am going to make a movement to make sure that every single agent in this world stops calling it the CIT.
The CTA, sorry. I usually do call it that, but I'm working with a New Jersey agent and they used CIT.
I know. So
that has to be signed within that 5-day negotiation period.
So you could use as a buyer, hold on. Let me stop sharing and reshare a new screen so I can bring up the CTA. Just in case there's some people on here who don't know what the CTA looks like, just in case. So this is the change in terms addendums, the CTA. The CTA, you very well do not need, one common misconception is that you have to use the reply to inspection paperwork. You don't. You can write on a napkin that this is what the buyer wants and send it to the other side. You can write it in email. You can write it in a text message. The buyer can send you a fax. I mean, any of these things are possible. That form is there to assist you because it's a lot easier to have something, keep us organized. You could go right to a change in terms, Deb. You literally could skip over the reply to inspection, go right to a change in terms addendum and send it to the seller side. And yes, you would have to have this signed within that contingency period.
Within the 5 days.
Within your contingency time frame, whatever it is. In our case, we're using 5. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, it would be the 5-day negotiation period. It's that
Correct.
We can't get it signed in that 2-day period afterwards.
Well, see, welcome to the gray time frame, because if you read the contract clearly says within those 2 days after that negotiation period, the buyer has 2 options. And nowhere in there does it say accept the seller's last, response. Now, I mean, would a seller turn away and say, no, I take it back, or I want to move? I mean, we run into that. We put ourselves as agents in that mucky water. All right. When we put ourselves in that position not to have everything done in a timely fashion, there's nothing stopping you as a buyer's agent from changing those 5 days. If you know your buyer works nights and you can only reach them after they've had 12 hours of sleep or whatever it is, then change the 5 to a different number. Hey, sellers, if you want to tighten it up, change it to a different number. It's all negotiable. We only put those timeframes in there because unfortunately we had agents at the very beginning not filling in timelines. So it went to infinity and beyond like Buzz Lightyear. So the 5 can most certainly be changed and altered. If you want to only have 2 days of negotiation, boom, 2. Seller will only accept your agreement if we agree to 2 days of negotiation. Deb, you have a client who works crazy hours. I need 10 days for the negotiation period because it's going to take me that long. And you can go right to a change in terms addendum as a reply to inspection instead of a reply to inspection form. But yeah, Deb, if you read the way that the contract is written, it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't say in there except the buyer, the seller's last offer, does it? It's one of those things where agents are like, I didn't realize that. But the way that the contract is written, it says accept the property with the information stated in the reports. And if you look, that mirrors the same, paper, information that we have. They accept it, they're moving forward. All right, so. Okay, so Ro, this version of blue and red is available at parealtors.org. Okay. Greg, you're going to have to come on and explain your question to me. It's going to be a lot easier for me to answer more questions. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
So we submit our reply to inspections. Buyer asks for a $2,500 credit. Seller's agreeable to it. Both parties sign a CTA agreeing to the credit. Does that immediately close the inspection contingency window and prevent the buyer, if after that's now signed, from being like, you know what, I really don't want this place anymore, or I found another place, and basically using the inspections period as a get out of jail free card?
Line 461 to 63. If seller agrees to satisfy or buyer's proposal, or buyer and seller enter into another mutually acceptable written agreement. Buyer accepts the property and agrees to the release.
And furthermore, to protect ourselves, when we execute a CTA during the inspections window, should we put clarifying language on there that this ends or this satisfies the inspection negotiation period or something like that? Because, you know, they could have executed, you know, a seller credit based on some other reason.
And it's, I'm going to put you back to your brokers to find out how they want you to handle that. Because I've seen other people. Now, here's another thing, just to give you a warning as agents. Please do not try and commit mortgage fraud. All right. If you have a seller who's doing repairs and offering a credit to a buyer by submitting two separate change in terms addendums, one with the physical repairs and one with the seller credit on it, could potentially put you into jeopardy, and helping your clients go into jeopardy for potentially committing mortgage fraud by concealing the information from the mortgage company. And a lot of people might say, well, my mortgage rep tells me not to send it to them. Most likely your mortgage rep told you that verbally and did not tell you in writing to not send them that information. Please consult your broker on this. There's a reason why the change in terms addendum now has the repair paragraph along with the other change in terms addendums on it. All right, so be very careful that you are not assisting your clients potentially in committing mortgage fraud by concealing information from the mortgage lender. Okay. All right. All right. Yay, inspections. All right, good stuff so far. Title and survey. So we changed this to make sure that the buyer committed to a title company within X amount of days, 7 if not specified. What that stopped buyers from doing was taking too long to get the title report and then finding out there was a problem and then having an issue. So this gives the buyer X amount of days. Again, a seller could come back and counter with less days. You know, a buyer can put in more days or vice versa. This is all negotiable. It was only put in there as 7 as a hypothetical, just in case. You know, and this doesn't mean the title report needs to be received. Just for clarity, this means that the buyer will order the title. Okay. They will order this title. So they will order the title. They will not receive it. All right. Okay. Any other questions on this? I mean, G comes into, so F and G come into play and could potentially come into play along with E too, actually, come about this. So, if we look at the letter F, if a change in the seller's financial status affects seller's ability to convey title, what happens? Well, the seller has to notify the buyer. The change of financial status includes, but not limited to, what if the seller files bankruptcy? Because that could potentially happen. You know, foreclosure lawsuit against the property, monetary judgment against the seller, notice of public tax sale. I mean, you know, learning that the sale price of the property is no longer sufficient to satisfy the liens, that could happen. So if seller is unable to give good title and marketable title that is insurable by a reputable title insurance company, regular rates, etc., Buyer may terminate this agreement by written notice to seller with all deposit monies returned to buyer in accordance with paragraph 26, or take such title as seller can convey. All right, so if this title condition precludes the seller from conveying title, then the buyer's sole remedy is to terminate. All right, and the seller will reimburse the buyer for any costs that they incurred according to the terms of the paragraphs. So keep that in mind. If you're dealing with oil or mineral, you might want to use the OGM forms. Applicable if coal is existing, if there's any private transfer fees or anything like that. Notices of assessments and municipal requirements. If you look on paragraph 15, line 548, because we're coming into this with the city of Philadelphia. All right. In the event any notices of public and or private assessments as described in paragraph 10F, excluding assessed value, are received after seller signed the agreement but before settlement, etc. So always comes into question as to whether or not, like we just got, technically they released the 2023 tax assessments, right? But people haven't received their paper assessment yet. Go ahead, Ro.
Oh, you can go as it's your thought because I have, it's not related to this.
Okay. I mean, that's the whole thing. Do you disclose or not? I mean, I know a lot of agents are trying to, protect themselves as well as their clients by saying, you should go ahead and, do all your research as possible. So, yeah. So I know the paper has not come out yet, but the assessments are posted online. So go ahead, Ro.
So you may already have answered this question, but someone previously had a question about if there's a known list pendants that the seller is aware of. Is that disclosed on the seller's disclosure, or does it have to be?
It's on the seller's property SPD, which do you know of any lawsuits or anything along those lines?
Okay.
I mean, this talks about assessments. But again, if there's a lis pendens, it's better to disclose, but again, talk to your broker about that one.
Okay.
Because lis pendens could affect what?
The sale, everything.
Right, the transfer. It's like, hey, buyer, you might get it, but you might not.
Correct. Yeah. Or delay.
Right, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
So, Jack?
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Turn off that fan, Jack. Land that helicopter and unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. I actually have you on a flat screen behind me.
Oh, nice.
So it's like watching a movie. So I have you on both the computer and that. So sorry for that reverberation. Just to your point on the Phila.gov, it will tell you the taxes for next year, but they're still not official.
Correct.
So it's a way to calculate. Hopefully it's accurate, but until you actually receive the notice from OPA after Labor Day, that's like the best guess. So just be careful putting whatever you want in an agreement, because it may not be the exact dollar.
Right, and that it's just, again, you have not received your paper yet.
Yep.
Okay, so do we take it upon ourselves to look up any open violations on Alta and place them on agreement of sale? I always, so just as a practice for myself, I always arm the buyers with atlas.phila.gov and let them know they can look up any property within the city limits, look up who owned it, what district it's in, any zoning, any violations, any of that information. But as a buyer's agent, if there's violations, again, fill out the agreement of sale accordingly to protect your client, etc., and vice versa on the listing side. Do the best you can. Okay. All right. Now, paragraph 17 was put in there. Oh, sorry, I totally missed condominium. Apologize on that one. If you notice that condominium is locked in here on line 602, that's because that's what the law says. Within 15 days from the execution, you're going to order, the resale cert. All right. Also, you notice that this one is locked in, that you don't even have an option or an underline. because it's law that within 5 days after they receive the condo docs, they have the right to review them and make a decision to stay or go. Nothing you can do about that. Paragraph 17 lets buyers know, like, hey, you're going to buy a property, and it very well could be that the municipality you're purchasing in will take the agreement of sale price and the final sale price that you have and calculate your taxes accordingly. So we warned you. Now, maintenance and risk of loss is a good one, because what if something breaks in the property while you're under contract? Because it tells the seller you're going to maintain the property, all right, including but not limited to structures, grounds, fixtures, appliances, and personal property. How many times have you had a seller stop mowing the lawn? Anybody ever have that happen? They just stop mowing the lawn because, well, I put the house under contract. You still got to mow the lawn and water the grass and everything. Specifically, this in the agreement of sale and present normal condition, etc. I mean, this is the whole thing. What if they don't fix something? Or what if they do? So if something breaks, what happens? You come to this section, all right? Home warranties outlines that there are warranties that exist, and, you know, whether or not there is any business relationship between the warranty company and the brokerage should have been disclosed. Any recording of the agreement is not done. It's not recorded in the county courthouse or anything. It does not get recorded. Assignment is another one. Unless otherwise agreed between the parties, it cannot be assigned. And then it also, they put on line 658 that an assignment of this agreement may result in an additional transfer tax. So you got to be careful about that too if they're flipping agreements. Governing law, where we're actually going to handle everything, would be in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And then what's FIRPTA? Paragraph 23. What's FIRPTA? Foreign Investment Act. I see Deb telling me. So where did FIRPTA come from? Well, FIRPTA has been around. Hey, hold on to yourself. You ready? Since 1980. FIRPTA is not brand new. So FIRPTA is Foreign Investment Act, and a lot of people get to this and be like, oh, but you're not a foreign investor, you don't have to worry about that. Problem is, it has nothing to do with whether or not the buyer is a foreign investor. It has to do with whether or not the seller is a foreign investor, and according to the United States government, could hold the buyer responsible for the capital gains tax should it not be withheld or paid by the seller if they're a foreign investor. Now, we had we went back and forth with the committee to try and figure out where to, put the Foreign Investment of Real Property Act, because the buyer would want to know, et cetera. And obviously we want to avoid any discrimination or profiling whatsoever. So we most recently posted FIRPTA in the listing contract, if you're using the PAR listing contract, to hopefully start a conversation with the listing agent and their client to say, does this apply? Because if this applies, then letting the title company know and vice versa. And in most cases, the title company will pick it up, but you don't necessarily want to wait until that time frame. But that does exist. That's why it's in here. When it comes to notice of regarding sex offenders, clearly lets the parties know that we are not responsible. They should do their own investigation, and they're encouraged to do that on their own. When it comes to representations, all right, my as-isers, this one's for you. All right, in bold, line 685, unless otherwise stated in this agreement, buyer has inspected the property before signing this agreement or has waived the right to do so and agrees to purchase the property as its condition. So my as-isers and my sight unseers, all right, my sight unseers and my as-isers. When the buyer signs this agreement, they're agreeing that they've either waived the right, okay, they waived it before signing. So buyer has inspected the property before signing this agreement or has waived their right to do so. So a lot of people ask for, can we get a sight unseen addendum, et cetera. I know a lot of your brokerages has come up with sight unseen addendums to protect yourself, and that's great. That's awesome. PAR has decided not to. It's built into this, letting them know you waived your right to do so. By signing this, you agree. So you agree to purchase the property in its present condition. So a lot of people, well, what is as is, and vice versa? when the buyer signs the contract, they are purchasing the property as it currently stood. So another thing is, like, say if the seller said, oh, the screen door broke and we're going to have that replaced. So it's subject to inspection contingencies elected. Buyer acknowledges that the broker's licensees, employees, or offers have made not any independent examination or determination, the age or anything like that. So you let us off the hook. Nor have they made a mechanical inspection of the systems. Any repairs required by this agreement will be completed in workmanlike manner, and brokers have provided, services to assist representation. So if there's a broken screen door or something like that, you need to negotiate that and make sure it's part, like seller will replace screen door. Otherwise, the buyer is purchasing the property with the broken screen door. Like there's no guarantee that it will get replaced. So cover yourself and make sure that if the seller said, oh, I'm going to replace that you go ahead and get that done. So be very careful, because if you notice, we don't use as is condition. It's used in its present condition, because currently when they wrote the agreement versus when they go to settlement. Any questions so far? Okay. All right. So default. Let's talk about default. It's one of my favorite topics. So how many of you are changing the time frame under 26C? 26C. Okay. Got a couple people raising their hands. I got a couple people I haven't seen their faces ever, so I don't know if they're raising their hands or not. We'll just pretend they are. All right. So currently the default is 180 days. How long is 180 days? Anybody know? Okay, thank you. Yep. 180 days, 6 months. That's 6 months for the seller to think about it. There's nothing in this paragraph that says the seller has to have an ironclad reason for not agreeing to return the deposit, does it? It just says they have to dispute it. So I have seen all different time frames changing here. Now, of course, everybody might be like, why are you using 180 days? Why are you 180? Well, okay, well, because it was 365. So 180 is better than 365, isn't it? Doesn't stop you from changing this here. I've got some people saying they're using 30, 15, 10, 5, 1, whatever floats your boat and the buyer and seller agree to. But the key thing you have to remember here is that buyer and seller agreed that if there is a dispute over the entitlement to the deposit monies that is unresolved, you can clearly have the seller disputing it. They may not be right, but guess what? They're still disputing it. They can hold up the money. Why this paragraph came into play was because, and if I know I have some brokers on here and managers, you can attest to the fact that there are real estate companies still holding on to deposits from the 90s and 80s because there was no resolution. This helped get some sort of resolution that said, listen, seller, if you're not going to sign off on it and you don't do anything to move forward, then after this time frame elapses, whatever's written in here, let's just say 180, the buyer can make a request to whom? The listing broker, right? Now, another thing you have to keep in mind is that the listing broker then, within, on line 709, within 30 days of receipt of buyer's written request. So the broker then has 30 days to make sure that there wasn't anything filed. So when you put 30 days on line 707, it's not really 30, it could be potentially what? 60. If you put 15, it's 45. If you put 180, let's do math. 100, it's 210. Yeah. So the broker, and the reason why the broker gets 30 days is because on the very last day, the seller could have filed something. So this broker can't just return the funds if there's something has been filed. So keep that in mind. If you have a buyer who needs the funds from that deposit to put a deposit on the next property, you want to make sure you don't leave too much time on the table. If you're a seller, you might want to have all the time in the world to think about it. Now, here comes one of the things where I'm going to clear up some confusion, where buyer's agent thinks that the seller cannot sell the property while they're disputing the deposit. And that is not correct. If the buyer terminated the contract and the deal is no longer on the table, and just because they're disputing the deposit, the seller could potentially put the property under contract and sell it with somebody else. Unless you file, unless you talk to an attorney and they file whatever they need to file to stop you from selling until this is resolved, don't assume that they can't sell the property, okay? This is why it says on the termination that they've consulted an attorney. They should consult an attorney and checked out all their options, okay? Now, let's talk about E. So E says seller has the option of retaining all sums paid by buyer, including the deposit monies, should the buyer fail to make any payment as specified in paragraph 2, or furnish false or incomplete information to the seller, broker, or any other identified in this agreement concerning the buyer's legal or financial status. So when the buyer gets all boisterous on the buyer's financial information statement saying they have all this money and can close, and the seller is looking at that saying, oh, yay, this is a good solid buyer, then the buyer says, no, I lied, you could have a problem. And then as liquidated damages for such default. Now, the next checkbox, seller is limited to retaining sums paid by buyer, including deposit monies, as liquidated damages. If that box is checked, that means the seller can only come after the buyer for their deposit. If that box is not checked, what does that leave the seller open to do? A lot of different things.
Through your butt.
Yeah, a lot of different things. So on the listing side, on the seller representation side, do you want G checked or unchecked? Have you ever really even thought about it?
On the list side, you want it unchecked.
Absolutely, Kevin. But how many listing agents actually go to bat on that one, though? It's become a hot button topic more recently. So F says, unless otherwise checked in paragraph G, seller may elect to retain those sums paid by buyer, including deposit monies, blah, 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 blah. If that's unchecked, go ahead, Greg. It leaves the seller open to more opportunities. Go ahead.
Sorry for all my questions.
No, ask away.
So going back up to the thing we were just talking about before this with the 180-day default or whatever like that. Let's say, so basically what it's saying is if there's a dispute that's unresolved, then after 180 days, listing broker obviously has to return the funds if requested by buyer. My question is court action the only thing that is valid, a valid reason for the listing broker to continue to keep a buyer's deposit?
All right, so just clarity on this. It's they only after they receive the buyer's written request within 30 days. So keep that in mind. It's not like the broker automatically turns around and returns the deposit.
Okay.
All right. So keep that in mind. 709 says, then the broker holding the deposit will within 30 days of receipt of buyer's written request.
Right.
Okay, so keep that in mind. So broker will continue to hold the deposit monies until receipt of a written distribution agreement comes into play between buyer and seller or final court order. Now, there are other laws that are in play where, if it's going to go longer than 30 days, the actual broker can petition the courts to take the money. That is an option. But the broker,
the point is there has to be some kind of legal action taken by the seller to try to keep the deposit money in order for that time frame in order for that protection to not exist for the buyer.
Right. So yes, the seller actually has to take action and do something. but giving
Action
the
is
seller,
defined as something through the courts.
well, no, it could be mediation requests, it could be arbitration, it could be, there's a whole bunch of different things that could be out there. Yes, it could be hiring an attorney, any of those things that could trigger it.
But can seller, like, literally, let's say we get to day 179, can seller send through their agent an email to the buyer's agent saying seller would like to request mediation?
Yeah. This is why the broker takes an additional 30 days to make sure that nothing was filed anywhere or anything like that happened on the last day of last hour. Anything's possible, Greg.
Got it.
You never want to, but the key thing is before we had this language, it was eternity, or it felt like eternity. At least this now puts a time frame on it that says if y'all can figure it out and there's dispute and nobody does anything, we can't just constantly stare at each other. I mean, there are deposits that are being held when both parties are deceased. And now what?
Got it.
Yeah. Talk about the good old days.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, if you look online, 714, buyer and seller advised to initiate litigation or mediation for any portion of the deposit monies prior to any distribution made by broker pursuant to this paragraph. You agree to the distribution of monies based on the passage of time. I mean, there's all sorts of things that go into this. It's not an automatic, but one of the key things that you have to understand is that when it comes to the release, no matter if your client thinks like the buyer is like, it's a clear cut, they got out because of the home inspection, they're terminating because of the home inspection, and the buyer's agent is like, well, give us our money back. It's not up to the broker or the agent if the seller refuses to sign. If you've given the seller 180 days, there are some sellers who are just spiteful and would sit on it for 180 days. So, they could be saying, I'm thinking about whether or not I want to do anything. So remember that when you're putting the contracts together and you're going over these clauses with your clients, what it could really mean. And for listing agents, I'll be interested to see what happens if we start seeing G get unchecked. I don't know. Because then there is mediation available. We do have mediation available to all parties. If you're a realtor and you're on this call, you belong to the Greater Philadelphia Association of Realtors, you have mediation available to you. When we talk about release, obviously it's releasing. So anytime it refers to paragraph 28, this is what it's going for. The Real Estate Recovery Fund is another one that has to be in all of our contracts. That's why it's everywhere that you can see. It lets people know that if you have a judgment against a real estate agent in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, you've exhausted all of the possibilities and defined underneath their law, you could go after the Real Estate Recovery Fund. When we talk about communications, again, we had to put that in there just to let them know. So if buyer is obtaining mortgage financing, buyer shall promptly deliver to broker for buyer any copies of loan estimates and closing disclosure upon receipt. Again, that helps you in getting those documents in advance for your client. When it talks about communication delivery to a buyer, that provision shall be satisfied by communication delivery to the broker for buyer. So again, you are an extension of your client. All right. And that there's an exception. So when you think you hand over the condo docs to the agent that the time starts to tick, those docs need to be in the possession of the buyer. All right. Otherwise, the agent is perfectly fine. Let's see. So wherever the agreement contains a provision that allows communication delivery to a seller, that provision shall be satisfied for delivery to their broker. So same thing. All right. So headings are there just for help and information. When we get into the special clauses section, anytime you check any of these, they are now attached to the agreement of sale. Example of using one of the 3 lines could be if you have an escalation addendum to the agreement of sale. You might check off one of the blank lines and price, escalation agreement to the agreement of sale. Any questions on any of these addendums made part of the agreement? This paragraph gives me agita. All right. Be very careful what you're putting in 32B. I've seen it used for seller will purchase home warranty for buyer, for 1 year, not to, exceed X amount of dollars. I have seen, the further information regarding inclusions in the property. That's why we leave it the way it is, but we get very, you be careful not to become an attorney. All right. It's always good to run any language that you're going to be putting into this contract, to your broker. And this includes, all right, when it talks about time frame, I see a lot of, weekends and holidays don't count. I can't remember the exact phrasing that is utilized. Trying to remember how it's phrased. So just be careful when you're putting any of that terminology in there that you're covering yourself and you've had it cleared by your broker before you go ahead and type in here. Let me see. Well, as is again, Aileen, we go to the fact of what does it mean? All right. So, again, when we get down to line 801 and beyond, you're letting them know, hey, buyer and seller acknowledge receipt of a copy of this agreement of sale at time of signing. That isn't just a statement. That is actually the law. You need to give a copy of the contract to your clients. All right. Don't assume that they have it, make sure they get a copy. It may be executed in one or more counterparts, each of which shall be deemed an original, by which counterparts together shall constitute one and the same. So you can have two agreements with signatures on it and put it together, it equals one. When signed, this agreement is a binding contract. So in Pennsylvania, we do not have a 3-day right of rescission attorney review. Once it's signed, it's signed. So they should consult a Pennsylvania attorney before signing if they desire legal advice. When return of this agreement and any addendum, including return by electronic transmission, that could be email, it could be fax, etc., bearing all signatures. It could be also electronic DocuSign that we use now, or .loop. Bearing the signatures of all parties constitutes acceptance by all parties. So we had to cover ourselves by letting people know electronic transmission is acceptable if it's emailed to you, forwarded to you, etc. So under the law, all right, so please clarify business days and holidays involvement. Our contract is calendar days. So a day is a day, Monday through Friday, including holidays and weekends. So unless it's otherwise stated in the contract, we count calendar days. So we have buyer's initial off that they've received the consumer notice, they've received a statement of their estimated closing costs. Again, two things that are required by law, by our real estate commission. That they received the deposit money notice. Now, I know a lot of agents send the deposit money notice with the agreement of sale to the other side. It's really only a single-sided document. It's between the agent who is receiving the deposit and will be handing it off to another agent, but you are letting them know that you've given it to them. Buyer has received the lead-based paint hazards disclosure. So the lead-based paint hazard disclosure is the only one the buyer initials off that they've received that, and to protect your family from lead in your home. They do not, it's not this, there's no seller's disclosure on here whatsoever. So a lot of agents are like, well, what happened to it? Well, it disappeared actually a while ago because there's nothing saying that they actually have to sign the seller's property disclosure statement. So before the seller signs, the seller has received the consumer notice and an estimate of the closing cost, because again, that is law. So let me pull up something here for you. Let me see if I can get this to share. So when I talk about the seller's property disclosure law, this is it right here. So when it talks about this delivery of disclosure, parties to whom delivered, for purposes of this chapter, delivery to one prospective buyer or buyer's agent is deemed delivery to all persons intended to take title as co-tenants, joint tenants, or as tenants by entireties with the buyer. Now, receipt may be acknowledged on the statement, on the disclosure, in an agreement of transfer for the residential real property, or shown in any other verifiable manner. So this is another reason why it wasn't necessarily left on the agreement of sale because, you know, we have initials on the document and that's how we use as verifiable. But, you know, honestly, if you read it the way that we've delivered it, as long as the seller has delivered it to the buyer, it's an interesting thought process. Jack?
Yes, what's also interesting is that if the buyer doesn't have to sign it, then a seller realtor cannot require a copy of the signed copy of the signed statement.
Well,
correct?
It becomes, and this is where it's become one of those tug of wars. You know, the listing agent wants to make sure that the buyer saw the disclosure, you know, and it goes back and forth.
Right.
On that, you know, I would
Just
talk
no
to the
requirement.
broker. Well, this is the law. This is what it talks about delivery, you know, and what we get back. I mean, this is, you know what? I'll drop it in the, I don't think I can. But I mean, you could look up the, you know, 705, 703 when it gets into the, you know, real estate sellers disclosure law, which is chapter 73.
Yeah, maybe it's in the state law.
Well, a lot of agents have turned, you know, they turn back and say, well, didn't the buyer initial off that disappeared a long time ago, that the buyer initialed off on receiving the seller's disclosure. Yeah. We just didn't realize it because the lead was still on there. All right, Ro?
So I have a question about a transaction agreement. Do we have to use a transaction agreement if it's just a transaction, or can you use the agreement of sale? I found that.
Are you talking about transaction licensee?
Correct.
Where you're not, so before we go ahead and you do that, you need to consult with your broker and your E&O insurance policy, because you may not be covered.
Okay, but I know that we are allowed to use it. We're allowed to use that. In the previous agency, we were not allowed to do any transaction.
Yeah, so always good to check with your broker and your E&O insurance to see if you're covered under transaction licensee status. If you do transaction licensee, on the very first page of the agreement of sale, underneath the relationship, there's a checkbox at the bottom of each of those boxes that says transaction licensee.
Correct.
Broker and licensee or licensees provide real estate services, but do not represent buyer, and then do not represent seller.
Correct. I just was under the impression that the transaction contract was in replace of the agreement of sale.
I don't know. I have to specifically look at the contract you're talking about, but the agreement of sale offers the ability for a transaction licensee to check off their relationship.
Okay, yeah, I've done that before.
But of course, before anybody goes out there and starts doing transaction licensee, please consult with your broker and your E&O insurance.
Got it. Okay.
All right. I've got Anna, and then Aileen, I see that you're raising your hand in the chat. Go for it, Anna, and then Aileen. Anna Rocco, you're on mute. Okay. Until you can figure out where to get I'm going to go to Aileen.
Hey, it's Mark again.
Hi, Mark. I'm still going to call you Aileen until you change
hello.
your
I'm
name.
sorry. I thought I was unmuted.
Oh, sorry.
I have a question regarding the seller's property disclosure.
Uh-oh.
I
whole
thought
different
it was a mandatory and a requirement to have with the agreement.
So what is mandatory is that before the buyer signs the agreement, they should have seen it.
Hello.
Anna.
Hello.
Anna.
Oh,
Anna.
hello.
Anna, can you hear me? All right, Anna, if you can hear me, it's a requirement that the buyer sees it prior to signing the agreement of sale. Yes.
But is it a part of the agreement? It should be.
No.
But then how do you have proof that they have seen it?
Well, that's why we have initials at the bottom of the seller's property disclosure statement, or emails, or paper trails.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. If I got a little confused when you had said it doesn't have to be
What I'm saying is the law says that when it comes to the law, let me see, I pull that back. Oh shit, did I lose it? When it comes to the actual law of the written seller's property disclosure statement, when it talks about, was it 703? Give me 1 second. When the law talks about how it is given to the buyer, like how they receive it. So it says delivery of disclosure form and how the method of delivery. It says seller shall deliver the property disclosure statement to the buyer by personal delivery, first class certified mail, return receipt requested, or facsimile transmission to the buyer or the buyer's agent. That's what it says right now. Any of you doing that?
Well, we normally the buyer's agent receives it, has the buyer sign it, then they should give us a copy back, because if we don't have a copy back, how do we have proof that they have seen it?
But the law doesn't say you just says that they can resign. They may acknowledge receipt on the statement in an agreement of transfer for residential real property or shown in any other verifiable manner.
That they received it, but it's not required.
Anna, this is one of those things. It's the way that we practice versus what the law says are different. I would say continue to do what your broker wants, which if your broker wants a copy with their signatures on
absolutely.
it, Anna, go for it. 100,000,000%.
Okay.
You do
that's
Anna, you keep doing you. And I would not say it's the wrong way to do. You just keep doing you.
Okay. Just wanted to clarify.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no, I mean, it's always good to have as much as you possibly can to CYA, cover your assets.
Well, absolutely, because suppose there's something on that seller's disclosure that was wrong with the house, and then years from now, there's a year from now, there's a dispute
listen,
on that.
Anna, let's be clear now. If you're not waking up every morning and before you brush your teeth, as you look into the mirror and you're not saying, I could be sued for anything, you are not starting off your day right.
There you go.
Okay. It's whether or not they win is a whole different story, but somebody can sue you and not be right and not win, but still they have every right to, and that's just the way it is. But yeah, you do the best you possibly can. That's why I will always say, if you have questions about this and you're unsure, you want to have this question, you go back to your brokers and have the conversation with them and say, hey, listen, what about this? How should we handle this? Absolutely. 100%. Your broker, your manager, whoever's in charge, your team leader, whoever's in charge.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So, all right, Aileen.
Hey. My question is about the seller's disclosure as it relates to paragraph 25.
Of the agreement of sale.
Yeah. So in paragraph 25, we're saying, okay, we saw the property, we saw its current condition, we're purchasing in the current condition subject to inspections. There's also a seller disclosure that discloses things like hot water heater doesn't work, something like that. After the inspection, buyer comes back and says, I want this and that done. Can the seller come back and say, well, you had a seller's disclosure when you made the offer saying that hot water heater didn't work, or you saw that that window was broken. You can't now ask for that window to be repaired based on the inspection.
All right, let me show you something in the agreement of sale.
Okay.
Where it would make it clear as day as to what you can and cannot. So line 417 and 18 of the agreement of sale says the inspections elected above do not apply to the following existing conditions and or items.
Super.
Hot water heater, central air conditioning unit system, all electrical, knob and tube suckers. Oh, I didn't say that. This is being recorded and I take that back. But yeah, this is paragraph 12, but it is probably one of the most underutilized lines in the agreement of sale.
Very good. Thank you.
So that's clear as day. If the hot water heater is off the table, if the broken window is off the table, this is a potential area for where you can put it that says, hey, your inspections, they don't apply to the following what's already here.
If the seller's agent and the listing agent doesn't put that in, it's all good. It's fair game. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they're not excluded.
Okay.
I mean, you could point to the disclosure and say that you already knew about that. And then, there's something called selective amnesia.
I don't remember what that is.
Exactly. Guarantee you there are going to be at least half of the class is going to say, Heather said this. And it's like, well, Heather did not say that. She might have, but let's play it back. All right. Is the first day of the execution the date contract was signed or the day after? It's actually the day after. So once the contract is signed, it's the next day. So I'm trying to see where it is. So extended. So it's 5C, I want to say. It says, for purposes of this agreement, the number of days will be counted from the execution date, excluding the day the agreement was executed and including the last day of the time period. So what that means is if it's signed today, the 28th, day one is the 29th. Okay. All right. Well, that brings us just about a couple minutes before noon. Everybody hanging in there, much appreciated. If you have any sort of recommendations for any of the forms, please know that GPAR does have, accessibility to PAR, and you have direct accessibility to PAR, but if you're not sure where to go, please reach out to GPAR and say, hey, but it's always helpful if you are specific with the name of the actual form, the abbreviation that it's catalog abbreviation, which can be usually found in the upper right-hand corner of the form. And if you specifically talk about paragraph and line number, that makes it extremely easy for us to go directly to that area to see what you're talking about. But you absolutely can go ahead and send emails to GPAR. You also have the legal hotline. Does everybody know the phone number for the legal hotline that is available through PAR? If we do not know, you can call and ask them questions. And if I could get out of my phone, Matt, I don't know if you have time to post that, because my phone seems to not want to get off of Comcast for some reason. I can't.
What do you want me to post, Heather?
Do you have the legal hotline phone number?
Oh,
By any
geez.
chance? I know. For some reason, I'm trying to go through my contacts, and it's stuck on Comcast. So let me see. I have it. I just pulled it up. All right, I'm going to drop in the chat the legal hotline phone number for the Pennsylvania Association of Realtors. You can call, you leave a message. And if you have a question about a form or you need clarity on something, they will help you there. It's part of your dues dollars. It's
Heather, you were amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ariel.
Yeah, you answered all of those questions.
Oh, that's good. 800-727-5345. I believe that's the legal hotline number. If not, I just gave you somebody's phone number.
No.
Is that not it? Is it 55?
I'm going to drop it in.
Is it did they change the number? Now I'm going to call just to. Oh, no, that's it. You can use that number. Yeah, that also same one. It's both of them, Matt. So you have that 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Monday through Friday. They're available. They are the attorneys typically who handle the addendums, the documents, the forms library. So feel free to call them. We do track the questions. That's very helpful to us to see if there's something that's happening. We appreciate all of you as members of GPAR. And I hope you guys have a great day, and hopefully you picked up one or two things. Take it back to your broker and talk about it.
Okay, everyone, thank you, Heather. Awesome. Great job by Heather. Thank you to everyone for all their questions. Super informative. Glad to see the level of participation. And with that, everybody have a great day. And
check with your brokers. Check with your brokers and your managers. They're always good. Good resources.
You can always be, and if you aren't thinking about lawsuits before you brush your teeth, the day's incomplete. All right. Take care, everyone.
All right. Heather, really quick, I just wanted to say this is Miriam Martinez. That Miriam. This is the best contract training I have had in the past 6 years that I'm in real estate. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Miriam. But GPAR likes to bring added value to our members.
Sure do.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
everybody
you.
for hanging in there
Bye-bye.
with us.